See, he didn't knock. He didn't send a letter. See, Silas Crowder simply walked into the county recorder's office on the same morning they buried Mara Ellison's father, while the dirt on that grave was still fresh, and filed a claim against the northern pasture of Red Willow Ranch. See, 600 acres of everything her father had bled for. See, gone on paper, before she'd even taken off her black dress. See, that's the kind of man Crowder was. He didn't wait for grief to pass. See, he used it. And when Mara's attorney called her that evening with shaking hands and a voice that couldn't quite find its footing, Mara didn't cry. See, she sat in her father's chair, stared at the wall he'd built with his own hands, and felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. See, not fear, something worse than fear. The recognition that she was completely alone and that someone had already calculated exactly how to use that against her. See, if that were you, if everything your family built for 30 years was being taken while you were still burying them, what would you do? See, before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. See, stories like Mara's don't come around often, and you don't want to miss what comes next. See, drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. See now. Let's go back to where it really started. The morning of the funeral, Mara Ellison woke at 4:30 out of pure habit. See, that was the thing nobody tells you about losing a parent when you've worked alongside them your whole life. Your body doesn't know they're gone. See, her feet found the floor before her mind caught up. See, she pulled on her work jeans before she remembered. See, she was halfway to the barn door before the silence hit her. See, no boots on the porch. No coffee already made, no sound of her father's low, tuneless humming that she'd complained about 100 times and would give anything to hear again. See, she stood in the kitchen for a long time. The cattle still needed morning check. See, the water troughs wouldn't wait for grief, so she went. See, because that's what you did when you were raised. The way Thomas Ellison raised his daughter, you kept moving, even when moving felt like dragging yourself across gravel. See, Mara was 31 years old, and she'd been running Red Willow alongside her father since she was 16. See, she knew this land the way she knew her own face. Every low spot where water pooled after rain. See, every fence post that leaned east because of that one bad summer windstorm they'd never quite gotten around to fixing right. See, 600 acres of rough, unglamorous, honest grazing country in Stonehaven County, and she knew every inch of it. See, what she didn't know, what nobody had told her yet, was that someone else had spent the last several months studying those same acres with entirely different intentions. See, the funeral was small. Thomas Ellison had outlived most of his contemporaries, and Mara had never been the type to collect friends the way some people collected furniture, filling space just to have it filled. See, a few neighboring ranchers came. Her father's attorney, a careful, soft-spoken man named Harold Birch, stood at the back and kept catching her eye in a way she didn't understand until afterward. See, he pulled her aside before she reached her truck, Mara. He said her name the way doctors say things before bad news. See, carefully, like the name itself might break. What? See, it wasn't a question. She was too tired for question marks. See, Harold had been her father's attorney for 22 years, which meant he'd been around long enough to stop softening things unnecessarily. See, he pulled a folded document from his jacket and held it out. See, Silas Crowder filed this morning, at the county recorder. See, against the northern pasture. She took the paper. See, read it again. Crowder was her father's cousin, a second cousin, really the kind of relative you acknowledged at funerals and promptly forgot. See, he'd shown up at the service that morning with an expression she'd mistaken for grief. See, looking back, she understood now that it had been anticipation. See, he's claiming partial inheritance rights based on an alleged verbal agreement with your father, Harold said. See, there's nothing in writing, but the way the estate papers were structured, your father intended to update them last year, as you know, and he, Harold, stopped. See, pressed his mouth together. He ran out of time. There's a procedural weakness Crowder's attorney is already exploiting. See, Mara stared at the document. Then she looked up at the sky, which was that flat, colorless gray that passes for winter light in this part of the country. See, if he gets the northern pasture, she said. You lose the grazing capacity for the spring contract, Harold finished quietly. See, yes. The spring cattle contract represented 60% of Red Willow's annual operating income. See, without it, she couldn't service the loan on the equipment her father had taken out 2 years ago. See, without that, the bank would eventually call the note. See, one piece pulled and everything followed. Crowder had known exactly which piece to pull. See, she handed the document back to Harold. Her hands were steadier than they had any right to be. See, what are my options? Harold was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was about to say something he'd rehearsed. See, there's one avenue that's unconventional, he said carefully. See, Crowder's argument rests partly on the claim that you cannot independently sustain the operation. See, that you'll have to sell. If that argument can be structurally dismantled. See, say what you mean, Harold. He met her eyes. Marriage to an established local rancher. See, someone with land, operational credibility, a community standing. See, it would eliminate the core of his argument before it ever reaches a judge. See, the silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. See, marriage, she repeated. It would need to be legal. See, documented. Crowder's attorney would look for any weakness. See, Mara looked out over the parking lot of the small church. See, at the gray sky and the dead grass and the county road that ran straight south toward Red Willow and the northern pasture that some man who'd shown up to her father's funeral was already trying to steal. See, I'll think about it, she said. She thought about it for approximately 48 hours. See, then she got up before sunrise on a Tuesday morning, saddled her horse because the eastern roads were iced over and she didn't trust her truck, and rode out across the frozen ground toward a place she'd been to exactly twice in her life. See, Gideon Mercer's ranch sat on 280 acres east of Red Willow, separated by a long stretch of county grassland and a creek that ran low in winter. See, Mara had met Gideon 3 times total, once at a county water board meeting 5 years back, once when he'd helped pull her father's truck out of a ditch during a bad November storm, see, and once briefly at a Ranchers Association gathering where he'd said maybe 12 words the entire evening and somehow still managed to be the person everyone else paid attention to. See, she knew what she knew about him by reputation. See, 49. See, she corrected herself. See, 39. See, she'd gotten confused. See, widower, 6 years now, ran a clean, respected operation. See, never cheated anyone on a cattle deal or a fence line. See, had a way of reading land and weather that older ranchers talked about, like it was some kind of instinct you couldn't teach. See, also, famously private, famously self-contained, the kind of quiet that isn't shy at something else. See, something deliberate, she had no real reason to think he'd say yes. See, she had no other viable candidate, and approximately 72 hours before Crowder's attorney filed for a temporary injunction that would tie up the northern pasture in court proceedings through the spring season. See, her horse covered the frozen ground at a steady walk. See, by the time she reached Gideon's property, the sun was barely cresting the hills, and the cold was the kind that settles in your collar and works its way down no matter what you do. See, he was already outside. She saw him before he saw her standing beside the fence line on the west side of his property, looking at something along the posts. See, he had a thermos in one hand and wasn't doing anything in particular, just looking. See, like a man who found something to study in things that everyone else walked past. See, when he turned and saw her coming, his expression didn't change. See, he watched her ride up the same way he'd apparently watched that fence line with a careful, unreadable attention that made Mara feel, for the first time since this whole nightmare began, see, like she was the one being evaluated instead of the other way around. See, she stopped her horse 20 feet from him. He waited. See, Mara had prepared a speech on the ride over. She'd rehearsed it in her head 4 separate times. See, the full explanation her father, the estate weakness, Crowder, Harold's advice, the spring contract, what she was asking for, and what she was prepared to offer in exchange. See, She had it organized logically, every piece in the right order. See, she opened her mouth, and what came out was just the core of it, stripped of everything else. See, Mr. Mercer, I need a husband. The words hung there in the cold air. See, Gideon looked at her for a moment, not with surprise exactly. See, not with discomfort, just looking the way he'd looked at that fence line. See, then he said yes, one word, before she'd explained a single thing. See, Mara stared at him. You don't know what I'm asking. See, you're Thomas Ellison's daughter, he said. He unscrewed the cap of his thermos, and she had the brief, disorienting sense that he was about to offer her coffee as though they were discussing feed prices instead of marriage. See, Thomas was a good man. You're on a horse before sunrise in below freezing weather, and you rode east instead of driving south to the county seat. See, that means whatever your attorney told you, the legal answer felt wrong, and this felt he paused, just briefly more direct. See, he was right. She hadn't even fully admitted that to herself. See, Crowder, she said, I heard he filed. Gideon recapped the thermos. See, yesterday afternoon, over at the hardware store. Earl Timmons knows everything that happens in this county within 4 hours of it happening. See, so you knew. I knew he filed something. I didn't know the details. He looked at her steadily. See, I still don't. You don't owe me the details to get my answer, but I'll listen if you want to give them. See, Mara dismounted. She tied her horse to the fence and stood in the frozen grass and told him everything: the estate papers, the weakness Harold had found, the spring contract, the numbers, the timeline. See, she talked for 11 minutes without stopping, which was more than she'd said to any single person in the last 4 days combined. See, when she finished, Gideon was quiet for a moment. What are you offering? He asked. See, not like he was negotiating, like he wanted to know what she'd thought through. See, it would be a legal marriage, properly documented like Harold said. See, you'd have no claim on Red Willow, I want that explicit and in writing. See, I'd expect the same protection on your property. When the legal situation is resolved, we dissolve it. See, quietly. No complication, he nodded slowly. And the timeline Harold needs? See, 17 days. He needs to file a response with documentation of the marriage before Crowder's injunction hearing. See, another silence. Mara had learned in those 11 minutes to let his silences sit. See, he wasn't stalling. He was thinking in the particular way some people think all the way to the end before they spoke. See, I have one condition, he said finally. Her jaw tightened almost involuntarily. See, here it was, the thing he wanted. She'd told herself she was prepared for this part. See, whatever arrangement we make, Gideon said, I don't want you thanking me for it. See, not once, not with money, not with cattle, not with land. See, if I say yes to you, it's because I'm choosing to. See, not because I'm owed something back. He looked at her directly. See, can you live with that? Mara wasn't sure she'd heard a condition like that in her life. See, that's she started, then stopped. That's your condition. See, that's my condition. She stood there in the cold for a moment, trying to find the angle on it. See, the hidden cost, the thing he wasn't saying. She couldn't find one. See, yes, she said, I can live with that. See, Gideon Mercer held out his hand, and they shook on it, standing in the frozen grass east of Red Willow at 6:40 in the morning, while the sun came up cold and thin over the hills, and her father had been in the ground for exactly 4 days. See, 17 days later, they stood in front of a county judge and signed their names on a marriage certificate. See, Mara wore her cleanest work clothes. Gideon wore a jacket she'd never seen him in before. See, Harold Birch served as witness, and afterward he went to file copies immediately, efficiently, before anything else could complicate itself. See, driving back to Red Willow alone, Mara told herself this was a transaction. See, a business arrangement executed under pressure. She had not married Gideon Mercer. See, she had deployed a legal strategy. There was a meaningful difference, and she intended to keep it clear in her own mind. See, she believed that, sitting in her truck on the county road. See, she believed it when she walked into the house that still smelled like her father's coffee and his wool coat by the door, and the particular silence of a life abruptly absent. See, she was still telling herself that when Harold called 3 days later and said that Crowder wasn't done, that, instead of retreating, he'd pulled his first argument and replaced it with something worse. See, he wasn't claiming partial inheritance anymore. He was challenging the validity of Red Willow's northern boundary itself, arguing that the original survey was flawed, that the land had never legally been fully the Ellison's. See, and that without a surviving copy of the original survey documents, Mara couldn't prove otherwise. See, the county's copy had been lost in a courthouse fire 11 years back. See, there was no record. Mara sat down at her kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed in through her nose the way her father had always done when something was very bad and you needed a moment before you could address it. See, then she called Gideon. She didn't know why she called him instead of Harold. See, she'd meant to call Harold. Her hand had gone to the phone and dialed Gideon's number as though her fingers had made a different decision than her brain. See, he picked up on the second ring. She explained what Harold had told her. See, her voice was flat and controlled and gave nothing away. See, she was proud of that. There was a pause on the other end of the line. See, then Gideon said, "Come over here, it's late. I know what time it is." See, come over anyway. She drove the eastern route. The ice had melted some, and the roads were passable. See, when she arrived, Gideon's kitchen light was on, and he had coffee ready, which she did not comment on because commenting on it would have meant acknowledging something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. See, he was standing at the table when she came in, and he had a wooden box on the surface in front of him. See, old with brass fittings on the corners. She recognized the style county documentation boxes, the kind they'd used for record-keeping 2-3 generations back. See, my father, he said simply, kept duplicates of everything that passed through the county surveyor's office when he worked there. See, he didn't trust the single copy system. Said it was asking for trouble. He lifted the lid. See, I've been going through this since you called. He found it 40 minutes later. See, the original survey of Red Willow's northern boundary. See, signed. Dated county seal intact. Mara looked at it for a long time without speaking. See, did you know this was here? She said finally, before we got married. See, the pause that followed was only about 3 seconds long. See, but it was the kind of pause that has weight. I suspected it might be, Gideon said. See, my father kept everything. I knew there was a chance. See, but you didn't say anything. No, she looked up from the document. See, he met her eyes without flinching. I didn't say anything, he said, because I didn't want you to think the yes came with conditions. See, or that you owed me something for it. He paused. The survey was separate. See, you needed a different kind of help, and I gave you that first. See, the survey that's just what it is. Something I had that you needed. See, Mara stood in his kitchen, holding a piece of paper that could save her ranch, and she felt something in her chest shift sideways in a way she didn't have a word for. See, she'd been braced her whole life for people to want something. See, her land, her resources, see, her compliance, see, her gratitude. See, every offer had always come with a bill attached somewhere. See, even good offers, even well-intentioned ones. She'd never once encountered someone who specifically, deliberately, refused to attach the bill. See, Gideon, she said. Thank you. She caught herself. See, I know you said it's fine, he said. Once doesn't count. See, she almost smiled. She didn't quite get there, but almost. See, she took the survey document to Harold the next morning, and Harold took it to Crowder's attorney. See, and Crowder's attorney went very quiet on the phone, in a way that Harold said he'd never quite heard before from a man who was normally never short of words. See, the second argument collapsed. Mara allowed herself exactly one afternoon of relief. See, then Harold called again. He's not done, Harold said. See, and Mara, who had grown up watching cattle and reading weather, recognized the pattern now for what it was. See, Crowder wasn't just trying to take her land. He was trying to break her down. See, piece by piece, argument by argument, until she was tired enough and frightened enough and alone enough that she'd settle. See, sign something. Take a fraction of what was hers just to make it stop. See, she sat with that knowledge for the better part of an evening. See, then she made a decision that changed the shape of everything. See, she wasn't going to just defend Red Willow anymore. See, she was going to find out who else Crowder had done this to. See, and she was going to make sure he couldn't do it again. See, that decision made alone at her kitchen table on a cold Tuesday night, while the cattle shifted in the dark outside and the survey document sat safely in Harold's fireproof cabinet, was the moment this stopped being about one ranch. See, it just didn't look that way yet. Finding out who else Crowder had done this to turned out to be harder than Mara expected and easier than she feared, and both of those things were true at the same time. See, which told her something about how much damage had been quietly sitting in this county for years without anyone connecting the pieces. See, she started with Harold, not because she'd planned to involve him further than the legal work. She was careful about how much she asked of people, always had been. See, a habit built from watching her father refuse help until the last possible moment and then regret it, but because Harold had been practicing law in Stonehaven County for 22 years and knew things that weren't written anywhere. See, she sat across from his desk on a Thursday afternoon with the window behind him, showing a sky the color of old pewter, and she laid it out plainly. See, Crowder tried the inheritance angle. When that collapsed, he moved to the boundary survey. See, when that collapsed, he'll try something else. She folded her hands on the desk. See, men who work like this don't improvise. They have a system. See, which means he's done this before. Harold looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. See, what are you asking me, Mara? I'm asking if you know anyone else he's targeted. See, Harold was quiet for a long moment. He took his glasses off and set them on the desk and looked at them instead of her. See, that was the tell Harold always looked at his glasses when he was deciding how much to say. See, there are names, he said finally. People who had disputes with land claims in this county in the last 8 years. See, some of them settled. Some of them, he paused, stopped fighting for reasons that were never entirely clear to me. See, give me the names. Mara, if you're thinking about going to those families. See, I'm thinking about going to those families. He pushed a long breath out through his nose. See, some of them aren't going to want to talk. They signed agreements. See, they've moved on or they've tried to, dragging it back up. See, will hurt less than letting him keep doing it to somebody else. She kept her voice even. See, the names, Harold. He wrote 3 of them down on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk. See, she folded it into her jacket pocket without reading it in front of him. See, she read it in her truck. Jonas Rourke, Lenora Vale. See, a 3rd name with an address 2 counties east that had a line drawn through it and a note beside it in Harold's careful handwriting, moved, whereabouts unknown. See, she sat with the paper for a minute. The heater in her truck was making that rattling sound it had been making since October, the one she kept meaning to deal with. See, the sound was somehow comforting right now, familiar and imperfect and real. See, she drove to Jonas Rourke's place first. Jonas was 63 and had the look of a man who had been doing heavy work his whole life and hadn't entirely recovered from some of it. See, his hands were swollen at the knuckles, and he walked with a slight lean to the left that he didn't seem aware of. See, he came to the door when she knocked. See, looked at her for a moment. See, and said, "You're Tom Ellison's girl." See, "Yes, sir." He studied her face. "I heard about your father." See, "I'm sorry." "Thank you." Another moment of studying. See, then he opened the door wider. "Come in." His kitchen was warm and slightly cluttered in the way of a man living alone who had stopped caring about surfaces. See, there was a radio on the counter playing something low, and he turned it down without turning it off. See, he didn't offer coffee, which she respected. She wasn't there for coffee. See, she told him why she was there. He listened without interrupting, which she also respected. See, when she finished, he was quiet for almost a full minute, looking at the table. See, "It was 3 years ago," he said finally. "My wife had passed that spring." See, heart. He turned his coffee cup around in his hands. See, I wasn't thinking right. You know how that is." See, the first year. He glanced at her and then away. Crowder came around talking about a right-of-way issue. See, said there'd been a question about access across the southwest corner of my property going back decades. See, said he had documentation. Did he? He showed me papers. See, I was Jonas stopped, set the cup down. I was in no shape to evaluate papers. See, I signed an agreement giving him access rights across that corner. See, 6 months later, I found out from my neighbor that those access rights had been transferred to a land company out of the county seat. See, a company that then tried to purchase the entire southwest quarter from me under market value, claiming the access agreement gave them leverage. See, Mara kept her expression neutral with some effort. See, I didn't sell, Jonas said. I got a lawyer eventually. See, but the access agreement stands. And it cost me, he paused, working the math in his head, it cost me real money every year in grazing capacity I can't use because of that corridor. See, he looked at her directly then. For the first time since she'd arrived, he looked at her straight on. See, you're putting together what he did, Jonas said. See, across multiple properties. Yes. Why? Because if it's a pattern, it's fraud. See, and if it's fraud, the individual cases stop looking like bad luck and start looking like what they are. See, Jonas turned the coffee cup around again. He had a way of doing it one slow rotation, then stopped that reminded her of something her father used to do with a pen when he was thinking. See, my daughter-in-law, he said. Her name is Eliza. See, she worked for a land records office over in Creston for about 4 years. See, she might know things that he stopped himself. See, started again more carefully. She left that job under difficult circumstances. See, she doesn't talk about it, but she's been wanting to talk about it for a long time, I think. See, sometimes you can tell. Mara wrote Eliza Rourke's name in the small notebook she kept in her jacket. See, she drove to Lenora Vale's place that evening. Lenora was 71, sharp as wire, and approximately as warm on first meeting as the weather outside. See, she lived on a small spread that had clearly been larger once you could see the old fence lines from the road. See, ghostly impressions in the land where boundaries used to run before someone had taken them back or bought them out or pressured them into oblivion. See, I know why you're here, Lenora said before Mara finished her second sentence. See, sit down. Mara sat. Lenora told her story the way some people tell hard stories fast, without decoration, like if she moved through it quickly enough it couldn't catch her. See, her husband had died 8 years back. Within 4 months, a man she barely recognized had shown up, claiming an interest in the eastern section of her property based on an alleged handshake deal with her late husband. See, no paperwork, no witnesses, just a claim, and a polite suggestion that it would be much simpler for everyone if she just agreed to a modest buyout rather than going through the expense of a legal challenge. See, she'd fought. It had cost her $11,000 in legal fees in 2 years of her life, and she'd kept the land, barely, but the eastern section was still clouded with a nuisance lien that nobody had been able to fully clear. See, the man who came to my door, Lenora said, wasn't Crowder directly. See, it was a younger man, polished, said represented a land investment group. She looked at Mara steadily. See, but I found out later, much later, that the group was connected to Crowder. See, through 2 holding companies. You had to look hard to find it. See, do you remember the name of the investment group? See, Lenora got up and went to a drawer in the kitchen and came back with a manila folder that was thick with papers, the edges soft from handling. See, she set it on the table between them. I kept everything, she said simply. See, Mara looked at the folder, then at Lenora. Would you testify if it came to that? See, the older woman didn't hesitate. I have been waiting, she said, for someone to ask me that question for 7 years. See, the drive back to Red Willow that night was long and dark, and Mara's mind was moving faster than the road in front of her. See, she had 2 witnesses with direct experience. She had Jonas Rourke's reference to his daughter-in-law and the land records office in Creston. See, she had Lenora's folder full of documents that connected Crowder to a network of holding companies that spread his fingerprints thin enough to seem invisible until you started pulling threads. See, this was bigger than one inheritance dispute. She needed to tell Harold. See, she needed to tell, and this thought arrived with a slight jolt of something she wasn't prepared to name. She needed to tell Gideon. See, she called Harold from her driveway. He listened to everything she'd gathered and was quiet in the specific way that meant he was recalibrating. See, when he finally spoke, his voice was careful and deliberate. See, if there's a pattern of fraudulent claims across multiple properties, this stops being a civil matter and starts being something that involves law enforcement, he said. See, I need to make some calls, not tonight, tomorrow morning. A pause. See, Mara, you need to be careful. If Crowder figures out you're building something against him. See, he'll escalate, she said. Yes, she already knew that. See, she'd known it before she knocked on Jonas Rourke's door. See, some things you did anyway. She called Gideon next. See, he picked up on the first ring this time, which was different from last time, and she noticed it and told herself it didn't mean anything particular. See, she walked him through everything: Jonas, Lenora, the holding companies, Eliza Rourke, and the Land Records Office, what Harold had said about law enforcement. See, Gideon listened the way he always listened, completely. See, without interrupting or jumping ahead. See, when she finished, see, there was a short silence. See, and then he said, see, you went to those families alone. See, yes, that wasn't safe. I wasn't in any danger, Gideon. See, not physically, but walking into those conversations alone, without knowing how they'd respond, he stopped himself. See, I'm not criticizing you. Another brief pause. I should have gone with you. See, Mara sat in her truck in the dark driveway and looked at the kitchen light she'd left on inside the house. See, I didn't think to ask, she said. You could have. See, she didn't have an answer for that. It was true. See, the thought of asking hadn't crossed her mind, because the thought of asking anyone for company on something like that had been so far from her natural instinct that it existed in a separate category entirely from things she considered doing. See, Lenora Vale, Gideon said, moving forward, because he seemed to understand she didn't have a response yet. See, she kept her documentation. That's significant. If Harold can use her files alongside what you've gathered from Jonas. See, I know. And Eliza Rourke. The Land Records connection, that's the piece that could tie everything together. See, if there's evidence that notarizations were done improperly, that documentation was created outside the presence of the landowners. See, Harold said the same thing. He's going to make calls in the morning. See, okay, a pause. How are you doing? Not how are you doing, with an upward lilt like a social nicety. See, just the question, flat and direct, like he actually wanted to know. See, Mara stared at the kitchen light. I'm fine, she said. See, another brief silence. Right, he said, and there was something in that single syllable, not sarcasm, not pressure. See, just a quiet acknowledgement that she'd given him the answer she gave everyone, and he was noting it, without calling her on it, that landed somewhere unexpected in her chest. See, I'll be out tomorrow, she said, early. I want to look at the northern fence line again before I meet with Harold. See, I'll come with you, he said. She started to say it wasn't necessary, because that was what she said to everyone about everything. See, she stopped herself. Fine, she said instead. 6:30. See, she went inside, and the kitchen smelled like coffee she'd made that morning and hadn't finished, and the house was as quiet as it always was. See, but for the first time in a long time, the silence felt slightly less like something pressing against the walls. See, she told herself that was just relief, progress on the case. See, nothing else. She mostly believed it. Gideon was at the northern fence line when she got there at 6:25, because apparently 6:30 to him meant arriving before 6:30, which was something she filed away without comment. See, he had 2 cups of coffee from a thermos. He always had a thermos. She was beginning to think the man slept with it and handed one to her without asking, and she took it without thanking him. See, and they stood at the fence line in the pre-dawn gray, looking at the northern boundary of Red Willow in comfortable silence. See, that was the thing about Gideon that she hadn't anticipated. See, the silence with him wasn't like the silence with other people, where you felt the pressure of it, the expectation that one of you should fill it. See, his silence was just quiet, uneventful, like standing next to someone on a porch watching rain. See, nothing required. She walked the fence line from east to west. See, he walked it from west to east. They met in the middle, and she showed him where two posts had been slightly shifted, subtle enough that you'd miss it unless you were looking carefully. See, pronounced enough to suggest someone had been examining that section with more than casual interest. See, someone's been here, she said. Gideon crouched down next to the second post. See, looked at the ground around it recently. Within the last 10 days, he stood up. See, before or after you went to see the Rourkes and Lenora Vale? See, after, I think. I was out here 2 weeks ago, and everything looked right. See, he looked down the fence line, east toward the horizon, where the sky was starting to shift from gray to pale gold. See, he knows something's changed. He might not know what yet. See, but something spooked him. Earl Timmons, Mara said flatly. See, Gideon almost smiled. Almost Earl Timmons, he agreed. See, the county's informal information network, which is to say the hardware store, the feed supply, and the parking lot of the county diner, was not exactly a place where anything stayed quiet for long. See, someone had probably seen Mara's truck outside Jonas Rourke's place. See, or Lenora's, or both, and word had eventually found its way to people who reported to Crowder. See, he's watching the fence line, Mara said. Yes, which means he's already thinking about the next move. See, yes. She stood there with her coffee cup and looked at the posts that had been prodded by someone else's hands without her permission on her land, and felt the particular quality of anger that she'd come to recognize over the last weeks not hot. See, not explosive, but cold and deep, the kind that didn't go away quickly because it wasn't based in feeling. See, it was based in understanding. Harold called at 9:15. See, she was back at the house by then, and Gideon had gone back to his property to check his own cattle before the day got later. See, she answered the phone with her coat still on, still holding her empty coffee cup. See, I made some calls this morning, Harold said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, not quite excitement, but something adjacent to it, controlled and professional, but with an edge underneath. See, Lenora Vale's documents. The holding company she identified, one of them, Meridian Land Partners, had its registration challenged 3 years ago in connection with a property dispute over in Fayette County. See, the case was dropped, but the sheriff's office there opened a preliminary inquiry that was never officially closed. See, Mara set her coffee cup down on the counter. They were already looking at him, she said. See, quietly. They had pieces, but nothing that tied the individual incidents together across county lines. See, what you have Jonas, Lenora, and potentially Eliza Rourke, if she'll talk it, might be the connection they've been missing. Harold paused. See, I've been in touch with a contact at the county sheriff's office here. See, he wants to meet with you, informally for now when. See, tomorrow afternoon if you're available. I'm available. See, she ended the call and stood in the kitchen for a moment. See, through the window she could see the northern pasture, the pale winter grass, the repaired fence line that Crowder had been surveying with someone else's eyes. See, the land her father had worked for 30 years. The land someone had decided was easier to take than to earn. See, she picked up her phone again. She called Gideon. Harold made contact with the sheriff's office, she said when he answered. See, they want to meet tomorrow. They've been looking at Crowder independently. See, what we have might connect their pieces. A pause on the other end. See, that's significant, Gideon said. Yes, you should call Jonas Rourke. See, let him know the direction this is heading. He deserves to know before it moves into official territory. See, she hadn't thought of that. She should have. Right. See, I will. And Lenora. Those documents she kept Harold needs originals, not copies, if this goes to law enforcement. See, he knows. Okay, a pause. Are you all right? There it was again. See, that same question, the same flat directness. I'm better than all right, she said. And this time she meant it more than the last time, which was something, even if she couldn't have explained what. See, she called Jonas. He listened to everything she told him and was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice that was carefully steady, Eliza. See, I think it's time I talked to Eliza, she called Lenora. See, Lenora said, tell that attorney of yours to come get the folder in person. See, I want to hand it to him myself. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with a map of the county spread in front of her father's map, see, the one he'd marked up over years with fence lines and water sources, and the particular character of different sections of ground, Mara drew a loose circle around the properties that had been targeted. See, Red Willow, the Rourke place, Lenora Vale's spread. See, the third name with the line through it that Harold didn't know the current whereabouts of. See, they were all within a 12-mile radius of each other. See, they all involved landowners who were alone or recently widowed, or in some form of financial or emotional difficulty when Crowder had approached. See, he'd been selecting them, not opportunistically, deliberately. See, she stared at the map for a long time, her coffee going cold beside her, the kitchen settling into its nighttime quiet around her. See, then she got up and put the map away carefully, in the drawer where her father had kept it, and she went to bed, because tomorrow was going to be a long day, and she'd learned from years of ranching that you rested when you could. See, because you never knew when you wouldn't be able to. See, the meeting with the sheriff's contact was at a nondescript office in the county building that smelled like old carpet and burned coffee. See, and the man who met her there was a deputy named Carver who looked about 50 and had the specific quality of stillness that Mara associated with people who spent a lot of time watching situations rather than reacting to them. See, he asked her questions, careful, methodical questions, working through the timeline from her father's death through the filing, the boundary challenge, the survey document, the visits to Jonas and Lenora. See, he didn't write much down in front of her, but she had the feeling he was recording it somewhere in the careful filing system of his own mind. See, when she finished, he looked at her for a moment. Miss Ellison, he started. See, Mrs. Mercer, she said, because that was the legal reality, and also because she'd noticed he was the kind of man who paid attention to names. See, he adjusted without blinking. Mrs. Mercer, I'm going to be direct with you because you've been direct with me. See, Silas Crowder has been on our radar for some time. See, what you've brought us, particularly the connection to Meridian Land Partners and the potential role of the Creston Land Records Office, fills in a gap we've had for 3 years. He paused. See, we need Eliza Rourke to talk to us if she will. See, I can't make her, Mara said. I know you can't, but you reaching out to her first, someone she knows is in the middle of this. Not just law enforcement coming to her door cold, it might make a difference. See, she nodded slowly. One other thing, Carver said. See, he leaned forward slightly. If Crowder gets any indication that law enforcement is involved, he may try to accelerate whatever he's planning. See, he's done it before. So between now and when we're in a position to move, he looked at her steadily. Watch your property. See, she drove home with that sentence following her like a second shadow. See, she told Gideon what Carver had said that evening, standing at the gate of her property in the last of the afternoon light, because he'd been there checking on the northern fence when she pulled in, and it seemed pointless to wait. See, Gideon listened. His expression didn't change much, but something in the set of his jaw shifted very slightly when she got to the part about watching the property. See, I'll check your east line tomorrow, he said. The section along the creek. See, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. She stopped arguing. See, what she didn't tell him was that night, when she made her rounds after dark, a habit she'd had for years, a last check of the property before sleep, she stood at the edge of the northern pasture in the cold and dark and felt, see, for the first time since this whole thing had begun, something that was not quite alone. See, not because anyone was standing with her. Just because, for the first time and as long as she could remember, there was someone who'd said they'd be back in the morning, and she believed them. See, she went inside and locked the door and told herself she was not going to think about what that meant. See, she didn't entirely succeed. 2 days later, she drove to the address Jonas had given her for Eliza Rourke, a small house at the edge of the next town over, with a truck in the driveway and a light on in the front window. See, she knocked. The woman who opened the door was younger than Mara had expected. See, mid-30s maybe. Dark hair pulled back, the kind of face that was currently careful, and had probably once been open. See, she looked at Mara for a moment, see, and then she said, see, in a voice that was very quiet, see, my father-in-law called. See, yes. Eliza studied her for a moment. You should come in. See, Mara came in. Eliza Rourke's story took the better part of an hour to tell. See, and it had to be told in pieces, because some of it was hard to get through, and Eliza was not the kind of person who cried easily, and so she had to stop and wait and collect herself before she continued. See, and Mara let her do that without rushing anything. See, the short version was this. Eliza had worked for a small land records office in Creston for 4 years, run by a man named Roland Varick and his wife Celeste. See, she'd processed land agreements, notarizations, documentation. See, she was good at her job and trusted in the office, and so she'd had access to things that a more carefully guarded employee might not have seen. See, and she had seen things. Agreements notarized with landowner signatures that she was fairly certain, she corrected herself, not fairly certain had never been signed in the presence of a notary. See, documents with dates that didn't match the processing logs she had access to. See, landowner names on agreements that, on 2 separate occasions, she'd later heard had been disputed by the landowners themselves. See, she'd raised it once with Roland Varick. Once. He'd been very calm. See, very polite. He'd explained that she had misunderstood the process, and that perhaps she was not as familiar with proper procedure as she'd assumed, and that he was sure she'd have no further concerns once she thought it through. See, 2 weeks later she'd been let go due to a restructuring. See, she'd taken nothing from the office when she left. See, she had been afraid to, but she remembered the names on those documents. See, she'd been remembering them for 4 years, writing them in a notebook she kept in her nightstand because she was afraid to write them anywhere visible and more afraid to let herself forget. See, when Eliza finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Mara looked at her across the table. See, the Varricks, Roland and Celeste, they're connected to Crowder. See, I didn't know that when I worked there, Eliza said. See, I found out later. Peripherally, I didn't have proof. See, would you talk to a deputy named Carver from the Stonehaven County Sheriff's Office? See, Eliza looked at her hands for a long moment. My father-in-law, she said, lost money and grazing rights because of something that went through that office. See, because of something I might have been able to stop if I'd been braver. She lifted her eyes. See, yes, I'll talk to him. Driving back toward Red Willow that evening, see, with the last of the light going orange on the horizon, and the heater rattling its familiar rattle, and Eliza Rourke's notebook of names, somewhere in the space behind her mind, where things settled after difficult days. See, Mara thought about what her father had told her once about fence building. See, you don't fix fence line by line, he'd said. You fix it post by post. See, you find the weak one, you fix that one. Then you move to the next. See, she'd thought he was talking about fences. She pulled off the county road at the gate to Red Willow and sat there with the engine running for a moment, looking at her land in the fading light. See, she was not done with this yet. She was a long way from done. See, but for the first time, the ground under her felt solid, and that was something she intended to protect. See, she drove in, and the gate swung shut behind her, and the lights of the house came on when she pulled up, because she'd left them on that morning. See, she went inside and fed the dog she'd had for 9 years, who was slowing down, but still glad to see her, and she fed herself something that could loosely be described as dinner. See, and she called Harold with Eliza Rourke's willingness to speak on the record. See, Harold's voice, when she finished, had that controlled but something underneath quality again. See, Mara, he said, do you understand what you've built in the last 2 weeks? See, she looked at the kitchen wall, at the marks her father had made measuring the door frame every year when she was a child, small pencil lines, with dates beside them, the last one from when she was 11. See, I understand. She said that it's not done yet. See, no, Harold agreed, but it's real. What you have, it's real. See, she hung up. It was real. It was also, she knew, just enough to make Crowder dangerous. See, and dangerous men who feel cornered don't stop. They look for the thing they haven't tried yet. See, she'd been watching the fence line. She hadn't been watching everything else. See, that oversight would cost her a night of hard, cold, desperate work, and paradoxically give her something she hadn't known she was missing. See, she'd been watching the fence line. She hadn't been watching the gate on the South Pasture Access Road, which was where they came through. See, she found out at 2:47 in the morning when the dog started barking, not his usual half-hearted announcement that something had moved in the dark outside, but the sustained, low, urgent kind that he only used when something was genuinely wrong. See, Mara was out of bed before she was fully awake, feet finding the floor, hand finding the flashlight on the nightstand. See, the same instinct that had gotten her for up sick cattle and broken water lines and a dozen other middle-of-the-night emergencies over the years. See, she pulled on her boots and her coat over her pajamas and went outside. See, she heard them before she saw anything, the particular sound of cattle moving when they don't want to move, the low bawling and the shuffle of hooves on frozen ground that meant the animals were unsettled, pushed. See, she went around the side of the house toward the northern pasture, flashlight sweeping the darkness, and that's when she saw it. See, the fence, the northern fence line, the one she and Gideon had walked just 4 days ago, the one with the posts that had been prodded by unknown hands, it was down. See, not broken down, not storm damage. Cut. 3 sections, clean cuts on the wire, fence posts still standing, but the wire hanging loose in coils on the frozen ground. See, and through that gap her cattle were moving. 63 head of mixed cow-calf pairs, the bulk of her spring contract. See, were drifting north through the breach and onto the disputed section of the northern pasture, the very land that Crowder's attorneys had been arguing belonged in a legal gray zone. See, by morning, if she didn't get them back, she'd have 63 animals standing on contested ground, and Crowder's attorney would have photographs and a story that wrote itself. See, she understood it in about 4 seconds. Then she stopped understanding and started moving. See, she got back to the house and called Gideon. It was 2:52 in the morning. See, he answered on the second ring. See, and she talked fast. See, and he said, 20 minutes. See, and hung up. See, she didn't have 20 minutes to wait. She grabbed the portable wire stretcher from the barn, the repair kit her father had kept stocked and ready, because fences went down and you fixed them. That was the reality of the work. See, she got her horse because the terrain along the northern boundary was rough in the dark, and a truck would bog down in the low spots. See, she rode out and began working in the dark with the flashlight clipped to her jacket, hands already cold, trying not push cattle back through the gap while simultaneously beginning to reconnect the wire. See, she was one person doing 2 people's work in the dark on frozen ground, and the cattle were not cooperative, and the cold was the kind that made the wire stiff and resistant and the stretcher slip in her hands. See, she'd gotten one section partially reconnected and had made approximately no progress on the cattle when she heard hoofbeats behind her. See, Gideon pulled up on his gray horse, already wearing his work jacket, already carrying a second stretcher and a coil of spare wire across his saddle. See, he didn't say anything about the hour or the circumstances or the cold. See, he looked at the fence. See, looked at the cattle position. See, and said, "I'll push them." See, you work the second section. She wanted to say she had it. See, she'd been saying that her whole life. She handed him her flashlight instead and went to work on the wire. See, they worked for the next 3 hours without stopping. See, Gideon moved cattle back through the gap in a systematic sweep, no wasted motion, reading the way the animals wanted to move and using it rather than fighting it. See, Mara worked the fence wire by feel and by the light from his flashlight. When he was close enough, her hands going from cold to numb to the particular painful warmth that means feeling is coming back whether you want it to or not. See, they didn't talk much. There was nothing to say that the work didn't already say. See, at one point, wrestling the wire stretcher on a section that was more damaged than she'd realized, she said a word under her breath that her father would have raised an eyebrow at. See, from somewhere in the dark behind her, Gideon said, yeah, in a tone of complete agreement, without either of them having to define what they were agreeing about. See, by 5:30 in the morning, all 63 animals were back on the right side of the fence. See, the 3 sections were repaired not beautifully, not the way you'd repair them with full daylight and proper equipment and a night's sleep behind you, but solid. See, tight, they would hold. Mara stood back and looked at the fence line, while the sky behind her was starting to go from black to that dark, dark blue that happens before dawn. See, she was cold all the way through. Her hands had stopped hurting, which was not a good sign, and she was flexing them in her gloves, trying to get the circulation going. See, she had frost on her collar and mud from the low spots on her boots and a smear of something on her coat that she'd deal with later. See, Gideon rode up beside her and stopped. They stood there in the dark, looking at the fence they'd just rebuilt. See, you okay, he said. My hands are bad. How bad? See, they're coming back. He reached over and, without asking, took her left hand and held it between both of his. See, not gently, exactly firmly, the way you warm something that needs circulation, practical and purposeful. See, after about a minute, he did the same with the right hand. See, Mara didn't say anything. She looked at the fence line. See, he sent someone, she said. Crowder did. Yes. See, this is what Carver warned me about. He escalated. See, yes. Gideon released her hands. She flexed her fingers, and the feeling was mostly back, unpleasant but present. See, you need to document this before anything else. Photographs of the cut sections before we touched them. See, I took them, she said. Before you got here. The cuts are clean. See, not random. The kind of cut you make with a specific tool and specific intent. She paused. See, boot prints, too. 2 sets of them along the fence line. See, I photographed those. He looked at her. Before or after you started repairing the fence at 2 in the morning. See, before, she said, and there was the smallest edge of something in her voice that was not quite defensiveness. See, I knew the documentation mattered. I took the photographs first. See, he was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. That was the right call. See, she called Carver at 6:15. He was already in his office, which told her something about the hours he kept. See, she gave him a quick, factual summary of the cut fence. See, the timing. See, the cattle displacement. See, the photographs she'd taken. See, he listened without interrupting. I'll send someone out this morning, he said. See, don't touch the boot print area again before they get there. See, I marked it. There's a stake on either side of it. See, a brief pause. You've done this before, he said. See, my father believed in documentation, she said. He said the only thing you ever regret not having is evidence. See, after she ended the call, she stood at the kitchen counter with the coffee she'd finally made and looked at the photographs on her phone. See, the cut wire, each section individually, the boot prints, side by side in the frozen mud near the south access gate where whoever it was had come through. See, 2 distinct sets, different sole patterns, different sizes. See, she'd photographed them from multiple angles. Her hands were wrapped around the coffee mug, and the warmth was working its way back in, and she was aware that she was exhausted in the deep tissue way that doesn't fix itself with a nap. See, Gideon was at the kitchen table. She'd invited him in for coffee without quite deciding to, and he'd come in without making anything of it, and now he was sitting at her kitchen table with his own cup, looking at nothing in particular. See, and the dog who did not like most people on first meeting had gone and put his head on Gideon's knee and was being tolerated with a rough scratch behind the ears. See, she noticed that. The dog's judgment. The way some things communicate themselves without a word. See, Harold's going to want to know, she said. Call him when it's a reasonable hour. See, 8. 8 is fine. She sat across from him at the table. See, the kitchen was warm, and outside the window the sky was going gray-blue with the approaching dawn. See, he's scared, she said. Gideon looked at her. Crowder, she said. See, this she gestured vaguely in the direction of the pasture. This isn't strategy anymore. See, strategy is what he did to Jonas and Lenora and to me at the beginning. See, arguments, paperwork, procedural pressure. This is something else. See, this is someone who knows his position is weakening and is trying to create a crisis, because that's what you do when you can't win the argument. See, Gideon turned his coffee cup around once, set it down. See, you're right, he said. And a scared man who's willing to cut fences at 3 in the morning is more dangerous than a confident one who files legal motions. He looked at her steadily. See, which means we move faster. Get Eliza to Carver today if possible. See, get Harold to push the filing on Lenora's documents. See, if Crowder is escalating physically, it's because he knows the legal ground is shifting under him. See, we need to move before he tries something worse. She pulled out her phone. See, it was 6:43. Harold could wait until 8. See, she doubted he'd appreciate being called at 6:43. See, she called Eliza Rourke instead. Eliza answered after 4 rings, her voice the careful, guarded voice of someone who'd been waiting for a call like this and wasn't sure whether to be relieved or afraid that it had come. See, he cut my fence last night, Mara said without preamble. See, he drove cattle onto the disputed land. He's escalating. She paused. See, I need to know if you're still willing to talk to Deputy Carver. See, today, if possible. The silence on the other end of the line lasted about 8 seconds. See, yes, Eliza said. Tell me where and when. That morning moved fast. See, Harold at 8, who called Carver, who arranged for Eliza to come to the county building at noon. See, Lenora Vale called at 9, who said, I'll bring the folder myself, and I'd like to shake that deputy's hand in a voice that made Mara feel briefly and uncharacteristically like she might laugh. See, Jonas Rourke called at 9:15, who was quiet for a moment and then said, tell me what I can do with a steadiness that cost him something. She could hear it, but he offered it anyway. See, the sheriff's investigators came out to Red Willow at 10 and spent the better part of 2 hours at the northern fence line and the south access gate. See, they photographed the boot prints, measured them, took casts of the clearest impressions. See, they collected wire samples from the cut sections. See, one of them, a young woman who moved with economical precision and didn't waste words. See, told Mara that the cut pattern on the wire was consistent with a specific type of tool and that they'd be checking it against a similar pattern from an incident in Fayette County. See, Fayette County again. Crowder's other territory. Mara stood at the fence line, watching investigators work, and felt the shape of the thing more clearly than she ever had before. See, this wasn't random opportunism. See, this was a practiced system, refined over years, applied to a particular type of victim in a particular type of circumstance, and it had been running quietly in the gaps between county jurisdictions where no single authority had a complete picture. See, until now. She was still standing there when Gideon came back across from his property, having gone to handle his own morning work and returned, which she'd expected him to do, and noticed that she'd expected. See, investigators are finishing up, she said. He stood beside her, looking at the fence line. See, how are your hands? Fine now, good. Eliza's talking to Carver at noon. See, I know. You texted me. He glanced at her. That was the first time you've ever texted me something that wasn't about fence posts or cattle. See, she looked at him. Is that significant? No, he said, and there was something in the corner of his expression that was not quite a smile, but was something in that neighborhood. See, just noticed. She looked away. Lenora's bringing her folder to the county building herself. See, she wants to shake Carver's hand. That sounds like Lenora. See, you know her. Knew her husband. Good man. He paused. See, she's had a hard few years. Mara thought about Lenora at her kitchen table, telling her story fast so it couldn't catch her, the old fence lines visible from the road where the land had once been larger. See, she's tough, Mara said. Tough and tired aren't mutually exclusive, Gideon said. See, she didn't have an answer for that because it was true and also because it landed somewhere personal. See, the noon meeting at the county building, she wasn't present, for Carver had said it would go better without additional people in the room, that Eliza in particular would be more forthcoming in a smaller setting. See, Mara understood that. See, she drove to Harold's office instead and sat across from his desk and walked him through the night's events, start to finish, while he listened, and wrote careful notes and occasionally asked a clarifying question in his quiet, precise way. See, when she finished, he set his pen down. The fence cutting is criminal mischief at minimum, he said. See, potentially more depending on the intent they can demonstrate. See, combined with what Eliza brings today and Lenora's documentation and the Fayette County connection, he stopped. See, Mara, I need to tell you something. His tone changed. See, shifted into a register she hadn't heard from him before. See, she straightened slightly. Crowder's attorney contacted me this morning, Harold said. See, before you called. He said his client is prepared to make a significant settlement offer. See, he used the words generous resolution 3 times in the same conversation. Harold looked at her steadily. See, he's panicking. Crowder told him to call before the noon meeting, which means he has someone inside the information flow who told him about it. See, the room was very quiet. He knows about Eliza, Mara said. See, I believe so. Yes. She thought about Eliza Rourke, who had been afraid to take documents from an office 4 years ago and had kept a notebook in her nightstand because she was afraid to let herself forget and also afraid to be seen remembering. See, she thought about what it meant that Crowder knew she was talking. See, is Eliza safe? Harold's expression tightened. I've already spoken to Carver about that. See, he's aware. That's not a yes. She's being taken seriously, Harold said carefully. See, that's all I can tell you. Mara sat with that for a moment. See, then what did you tell his attorney? Harold looked at her over his glasses. See, I told him that my client had no interest in a settlement and that he could expect our next filing to contain material he hadn't anticipated. He paused. See, I may have been slightly more direct than that, but that was the substance. See, she walked out of Harold's office at 1:15 and stood in the parking lot in the cold. See, the settlement offer meant Crowder was more scared than she'd realized. See, more scared than the fence cutting had even suggested. See, men who were confident in their position didn't panic offer settlements the same morning their operative cut fences. See, he was unraveling. She called Gideon. He made a settlement offer this morning, she said. See, before Eliza's meeting with Carver. A pause. He knows about Eliza. See, that's what Harold thinks. You need to tell Carver immediately if Harold hasn't already. See, Harold told him. Okay, another pause. Shorter. See, are you taking the settlement? No, okay. And that was all. See, no argument, no second guessing, no protective hedging. See, just okay. She drove back to Red Willow and went through the rest of the afternoon on 3 hours of sleep and forward motion and the particular discipline of not thinking too far ahead. See, Carver called at 4:15. Eliza Rourke was extremely helpful, he said. See, his voice had the controlled quality that she'd come to read, as meaning things were significant without being ready to be said fully. See, we're going to need a few days to follow some threads. See, I need to ask you to sit tight on anything proactive on your end. See, define proactive. Don't go looking for Crowder. See, don't contact his associates. Don't say anything to anyone that could be characterized as inflammatory. A pause. See, I know that's hard after last night. It's fine, she said. See, I have a ranch to run. Good. One other thing. He paused, and this pause had a different quality. See, we found something in Lenora Vale's documentation. See, a name on one of the holding company filings, Roland Varick. See, she went still. The same Varick that Eliza worked for, she said. See, the same one. His name is on the Meridian Land Partners registration as a secondary incorporator. See, we've been looking at Meridian for 3 years. This is the first time we've connected Varick to it directly. Another pause. See, Mrs. Mercer. What you've built here in the last 2 weeks, I need you to understand that this has moved considerably beyond your original property dispute. See, she stood in her kitchen in the afternoon light, looking at her father's marks on the doorframe. See, I understand, she said. She understood more than that. See, she understood that Crowder, who had operated for years in the comfortable assumption that his victims were too isolated and too frightened and too individually overwhelmed to ever connect their stories, see, had made a fundamental error the moment he targeted Mara Ellison. See, not because she was stronger than the others, not because she was smarter, or more resourceful or less frightened. See, but because she had nothing left to lose and no instinct for going quietly. See, her father had built that into her, she thought. Years of watching a man refuse to be pushed off land he'd earned. See, the stubborn, specific knowledge that some things were worth the cost. See, she was thinking about that when Harold called the next morning with something in his voice she hadn't heard before. See, something that sounded almost like urgency stripped of its professional coating. See, Crowder has produced a document, Harold said. His attorney filed it with the court late yesterday. See, I'm looking at it now. Mara set down the coffee cup she'd been holding. See, what kind of document? An alleged purchase option agreement. See, he's claiming your father signed it 14 years ago. See, granting Crowder the right to purchase the northern pasture at a fixed price upon the event of your father's death. Harold's voice was carefully controlled. See, if it's legitimate, Mara, it could override the survey advantage. See, it could still give him a legal claim to that land. See, the kitchen seemed to shift slightly. She put her hand on the counter. See, send it to me, she said. He sent it. She opened the file on her phone and read it. See, the language was formal and dense, and she read slowly, which she always did with documents, not because she was slow, but because she believed in not skimming things that mattered. See, then she got to the signature line, her father's name. See, Thomas Allen Ellison, in a handwriting that was close. See, that was almost right. See, that had the general shape and rhythm of her father's signature as she'd seen it 1,000 times on bills of sale and loan documents and the birthday cards he'd given her every year in the same slightly cramped, left-leaning script. See, almost right. She stared at it for a long time. She knew her father's handwriting the way she knew the fence lines of this property. See, not academically, not from study, but from the cellular level of familiarity, the way you know a voice, the way you know a gate. See, the particular way Thomas Ellison formed certain letters was as known to her as her own reflection. See, and there was something wrong. She looked at it for a full 5 minutes before she could isolate it. See, then she saw it, the first letter, the capital T in Thomas. See, her father's T curved to the right at the base, a small thing, a barely perceptible habit. See, the kind of micro-movement that writes itself into someone's hand over decades of signing the same name and can't quite be copied by someone who hasn't lived with the original long enough. See, this T curved to the left, just slightly, just barely enough to notice if you were looking for it. See, just enough that someone who'd studied the signature from documents and practiced and gotten very good would not catch it because they were focused on the overall shape, not the initial movement of the pen. See, she called Harold. The signature is forged, she said. See, silence. Mara the capital T, his T curves right at the base. See, always has. I have 30 years of documents with his signature on them. See, this one curves left. She was breathing carefully, the way she'd learned to breathe when something was very bad, and she needed to think straight. See, I want a forensic examiner on this today. I'm already making the call, Harold said, which meant he'd seen something himself, but had waited to hear from her first. See, Mara, if this is what you're saying it is, it's what I'm saying it is. See, then he just committed forgery. Federal level if we can tie it to the mail or any interstate filing. See, call Carver, she said, already dialing. She hung up and stood in the kitchen with her phone in her hand and looked at the forged document on the screen. See, 14 years, allegedly. Her father had supposedly signed this when Mara was 17 years old. See, the year after her mother had left and her father had put everything remaining in his life into this land and his daughter and the quiet daily discipline of surviving loss by working through it. See, she knew with absolute certainty that her father had never seen this document. See, someone had made it. Someone had studied his handwriting carefully enough to almost replicate it, and almost was close enough to work on a judge who'd never met Thomas Ellison, who had no reason to look at the base of a capital letter. See, who would see the name and the notary stamp and the apparent formality of the thing and accept it. See, except for one small curve in the wrong direction. See, The forensic examiner Harold retained worked quickly because Harold called in a favor he'd apparently been sitting on for some years. See, by late that afternoon, a preliminary assessment came back. Multiple characteristics of the signature were inconsistent with exemplars from Thomas Ellison's authenticated documents. See, the ink composition and aging patterns were consistent with the paper's stated age, but not conclusively so. See, full analysis would take several days. It was enough. See, Harold filed for an emergency hearing on the document's authenticity. See, he cited the forensic preliminary findings. He included, as a supplementary exhibit, 12 authenticated examples of Thomas Ellison's signature from property records and legal filings going back 25 years. See, he also, in a separate call to Carver, mentioned the name on the notary stamp at the bottom of Crowder's alleged agreement. See, Celeste Varick. Carver was quiet for a moment when Harold told him. See, then he said, I need you to sit on that for 24 hours. See, don't file it publicly yet. Can you do that? Harold said he could. See, he called Mara with all of this at 6 in the evening, by which time she was back at the northern fence line, not because anything was wrong, see, but because she needed to stand somewhere solid and look at something real while she processed the shape of what was happening. See, Gideon found her there. She hadn't called him. She'd noticed increasingly that she didn't always need to. See, she told him about the document, about the signature. See, about Celeste Varick's notary stamp. He listened in the cold evening air, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. See, he built this whole thing on paper, Gideon said. See, years of it. The holding companies, the options agreements, the notarizations without the landowners present. See, he built a system that looked legitimate enough to intimidate people out of fighting it. He looked at her. See, and it worked until someone noticed one wrong curve in a letter. See, my father was very particular about his signature, she said. See, he said you should always be able to recognize your own name. See, Gideon didn't say anything to that, but he heard it, she could tell, in the way he heard things all the way to the bottom of it. See, Carver asked Harold to sit on the Varick connection for 24 hours, she said. See, he's moving toward arrest, Gideon said. He needs the connection in place before Crowder finds out the notary stamp was identified. See, she'd reached the same conclusion herself if Crowder runs. See, he won't get far. Not with what Eliza gave them, and Lenora's documents, and now a forged signature with a traceable notary. He paused. See, he's cornered Mara. She looked at the fence line. See, the repaired sections, still not beautiful but solid. See, the ground frozen and pale in the evening light, the cattle settled on the right side of the boundary where they belonged. See, cornered men do desperate things, she said. Yes, Gideon agreed. See, which is why you're not going to be out here alone after dark until this is over. See, she looked at him. That's not a suggestion, he said, and his voice was level and quiet and clear in the way that it was when he'd made a decision and was simply stating it rather than presenting it for debate. See, she thought about arguing. The reflex was there, right on the surface. See, okay, she said. He looked slightly surprised. Only slightly. He was not a man given to dramatic reactions, but she saw it. See, okay, he repeated. They walked back toward the house in the fading light, and the dog came out to meet them at the gate and was insufferably glad to see both of them. See, and Mara let them in and made something that could loosely be called dinner, and Gideon sat at the kitchen table without being asked this time. See, at 9:30 that evening, Carver called. We've been watching Crowder's property since this afternoon, he said. See, about an hour ago, some activity we weren't expecting. See, we're accelerating the timeline. He paused, Mrs. See, Mercer, I need you to stay in your house tonight. Don't go to the fence lines. See, don't go to the outbuildings after dark. What kind of activity, she said. See, I can't discuss it. I need your word. She looked at Gideon across the table. See, you have it, she said. She hung up. Outside the kitchen window, Red Willow was dark and quiet. See, the cattle were settled. The fence lines were intact. See, the northern pasture was where it had always been, exactly where her father had put it on the first survey done before she was born. See, she sat at the table and didn't say anything for a moment. See, then, in the morning, before sunrise, before she'd even put the coffee on, the sound that woke her was not the dog this time. See, it was her phone. She answered it still half asleep, and Gideon's voice came through, low and tight in a way she'd never heard from him before. See, Mara, get up and get dressed. Don't go outside yet. See, your cattle water tank. She was already standing. See, what about it? Someone drained it overnight, all of it. A pause, just short. See, 60 head without water. I'm already at the perimeter. See, don't come out until I tell you. She pulled on her boots and her coat and stood at the kitchen door and gripped the doorframe and breathed in through her nose the way her father had always done. See, then she went outside anyway because 60 cattle without water in freezing temperatures was not something she could manage from inside a house, regardless of what anyone said. See, and because this land was hers, and she'd be damned if she'd stand at a window and watch it from a distance. See, the boot prints at the tank were still fresh in the mud. See, 2 sets again, the same 2 sets as the fence line, she was almost certain of it. See, but this time they'd left something else behind. One of them had dropped something in the mud near the tank access panel. See, something small, a leather work glove, the kind with a specific brand stamped on the inside of the cuff. See, Mara photographed it without touching it. Then she called Carver directly. See, and within 30 minutes of that call, with Gideon working beside her to get water to the cattle through an alternate line while investigators processed the scene around them. See, something shifted in the night, or rather in the pre-dawn dark that preceded the morning, that would change everything. See, her phone rang again, Harold, at 4:40 in the morning. See, Crowder's attorney, Harold said, and he sounded like a man who had not slept and did not care. See, he called me 10 minutes ago. He's withdrawing everything. See, all claims against Red Willow. He cited irreconcilable differences with his client, which is attorney speak, for I found out something I can't defend, and I'm not going down with him. See, Mara stood at the water tank with mud on her boots and frost on her collar, and 60 cattle drinking in the dark around her. See, everything, she said. Every claim. He'll file the formal withdrawal at opening of business. See, she looked at Gideon. He was close enough to hear, or to read her expression in the dark, because he looked back at her and waited. See, and Crowder himself, she said. Harold's voice shifted. See, Carver says to expect an announcement by morning. See, he asked me to pass that along. She understood what that meant. See, she hung up and stood in the cold with cattle moving around her in the dark, and she let herself feel it for exactly 1 moment, not triumph. Nothing that clean. See, but something that felt like the ground, finally coming up to meet her feet after a very long time of not being sure it would. See, then she went back to work. Because the tank still needed to be refilled, and the cattle needed water, and the sun was coming up in a few hours, and Red Willow didn't stop needing to be run just because someone had tried to take it. See, Gideon worked beside her in the dark without a word, and the frost came off the grass as the temperature dropped just before dawn, and somewhere out in the county on road she couldn't see, a process was in motion that she'd set in motion herself. See, piece by piece, post by post, the way her father had taught her to fix a fence. See, you found the weak one. You fixed that one. Then you moved to the next. See, the formal withdrawal came through at 8:47 in the morning, filed at the county courthouse with the kind of bureaucratic quietness that felt entirely wrong for something so large. See, Harold called Mara when it hit the system, and his voice had the particular texture of a man who had been practicing law for 2 decades, and still found moments where the work surprised him. See, it's done, he said, every claim. Withdrawn with prejudice, which means he can't refile the same arguments. See, Red Willow is uncontested. Mara was standing at the kitchen counter when he said it. See, she'd been awake since before the tank incident, which meant she'd been awake for something approaching 26 hours, and she had mud on her jacket that she hadn't gotten around to dealing with, and coffee in a cup she kept forgetting to drink. See, she said, okay. Harold waited, apparently expecting something more. See, thank you, Harold, she said, for everything. Don't thank me. he said, and there was something rough at the edge of his voice that she didn't expect from him. See, your father was my client for 22 years. He stopped. See, this is what should have happened. I'm glad we got here. See, she hung up and stood in the kitchen with the withdrawal document open on her phone, reading it twice the way she read everything that mattered, making sure the words said what Harold had told her they said. See, they did. She put the phone down on the counter. Outside, Gideon was still at the water tank. See, he'd stayed through the investigator's visit and through the long process of getting the cattle properly watered through the alternate line. And when she'd told him at around 7 that he should go home and sleep, see, he'd looked at her the way he looked at weather he didn't trust and kept working. See, she went outside. The morning was raw and clear, that particular cold that follows a hard night, and the cattle were settled now on the right side of every fence line, which was where they were going to stay. See, Gideon was at the far corner of the tank enclosure, crouched down, looking at something near the base of the access panel. See, not the investigator's concern. They'd cleared the scene just looking the way he always looked at things that had been tampered with on a property he cared about. See, she walked over. It's done, she said. Harold just called. See, Crowder's attorney withdrew everything. Gideon stood up. See, he looked at her. Everything, she confirmed. He nodded once, slowly, the way he absorbed information that he'd expected, but had been waiting to hear confirmed. See, then he looked back at the tank, at the muddy ground around it, at the place where the boot prints had been preserved and photographed and documented. See, good. She almost laughed. See, 2 months of her life, 2 months of the worst sustained pressure she'd experienced since standing at her father's hospital bed, and the man next to her summed up the resolution with one word and went back to looking at the tank base. See, good, she agreed. He glanced at her, and there it was again, that almost smile, the one that lived at the corner of his expression and never quite made it all the way. See, she went back inside and ate something for the first time since the previous afternoon, standing at the counter because she was too tired to sit, and then she slept for 4 hours because her body had stopped asking and started simply shutting down. See, she woke at 2 in the afternoon to her phone and a call from Carver. See, we made 3 arrests this morning, he said. Crowder, Roland Varick, and Celeste Varick. See, they'll be arraigned this afternoon. He paused. I wanted you to hear it from me directly. See, she sat up on the edge of her bed. Through the window, the light was flat and white and very still. See, how long, she said. At minimum, we're looking at fraud charges across 7 properties in 2 counties. See, forgery. The notarization violations alone carry significant weight. See, the DA is still building the full picture. Carver paused again. See, the evidence you gathered, you and your attorney, and the witnesses you found. See, Mrs. Mercer, that's what made this possible. I want to be clear about that. See, she looked at her father's coat hanging on the hook by the door. See, he'd hung it there the day they moved in, and she'd left it exactly there, which was not something she'd planned, but had happened anyway. See, Eliza Rourke, she said. She took the real risk. See, she did, Carver agreed. We're going to make sure that's recognized. See, she ended the call and sat on the edge of the bed for a minute, not moving, just letting the information settle into the parts of her that were still catching up with events. See, 3 arrests, 7 properties. See, the thing Crowder had built over years in the gaps between county jurisdictions, the thing that had looked from the inside like a series of isolated bad luck events for a series of isolated families, it was visible now. See, named. Someone had pulled the thread, and the whole shape of it had come out into the light. See, she'd pulled it. She got up, put her boots on, and called Jonas Rourke. See, he answered immediately, and she told him about the arrests. See, he was quiet for so long that she thought for a moment the call had dropped. See, Jonas. I'm here, he said. His voice was different, lower, slightly rough. See, he stopped, started again. My wife. See, when she passed, and then Crowder came around 4 months later with those papers. See, I've spent a long time thinking that maybe I should have fought harder. See, that I let it happen. You didn't let it happen, Mara said. See, he targeted you specifically because of when you were. See, because of what you were carrying. I know that. A pause. See, knowing it and feeling it are different things. She didn't argue with that because it was true. See, Eliza made all the difference, she said instead. See, she's the one who connected the notarization. Without that, Lenora's documents were circumstantial, and my forgery claim was one family's word against a document. See, she's been carrying that for 4 years, Jonas said quietly. See, she has. A long breath on the other end. Tell me when the hearing is. See, whatever I can do. I want to be there. She called Lenora next. See, Lenora said good in exactly the same register Gideon had used, which made Mara feel that she was perhaps surrounded by people of a similar philosophical disposition. See, then Lenora said, "Are you all right?" And it was the same flat directness she'd used when Mara first came to her door, the kind that meant she actually wanted to know. See, I'm better than I was, Mara said. That's honest at least, Lenora said. See, Mara drove to Harold's office late that afternoon. See, not because she needed to everything that required doing had been done, but because there was something she wanted to say to him in person, and she was not particularly practiced at that kind of thing. See, and she figured the practice had to start somewhere. See, he was at his desk when she arrived, and he looked like a man who had also slept very little, and his usually precise desk had 3 separate stacks of documents that hadn't been there last week. See, she sat down across from him. When my father updated you on the estate papers, she said. See, the update he never finished. Was there a specific reason he delayed? See, Harold looked at her carefully. He mentioned it in the fall. See, said he'd gotten around to most of it but needed another appointment for the property specifics. A pause. See, he wasn't unwell at that point, or we didn't know it. See, it was just a thing he intended to get back to. See, she nodded slowly. I want to complete it, she said. See, the estate update. Whatever he meant to do. I want it done properly. See, Harold picked up his pen, set it down again. Of course. See, we can start that whenever you're ready. Next week, she said. See, I'll be ready next week. She drove back toward Red Willow in the late afternoon, the sun going orange on the hills the way it did in winter, when the air was clear and cold, and you could see farther than usual. See, she'd been up and down these roads for 31 years, and she still noticed the light when it did that, the way it turned the brown grass gold for 20 minutes before everything went gray. See, her father had loved that light. She pulled into Red Willow's gate and sat in the truck for a moment, looking at the property in that golden hour. See, the main house which needed paint on the south side and had needed it for 2 years. See, the barn with the roof she'd patched herself last spring. See, the water tank that she'd deal with properly come spring when the ground was workable. See, the northern fence line, solid where it needed to be solid, imperfect where it had been repaired in the dark. See, it was all a little worn, a little overdue for things. See, it was hers completely and without question. She got out of the truck. See, Gideon was at her east fence line, she discovered, which meant he'd been there sometime during the afternoon while she was at Harold's office. See, he'd left a note tucked under a rock at the gate, post a practical Gideon-style note. Creekside post 3rd from north has frost heave. See, needs attention before spring. And below that, in the same unhurried handwriting, I'll be by tomorrow morning. See, she stood at the gate post and read it twice. See, the frost heave on the 3rd post from the creek had been on her mental list for weeks, and she'd been meaning to check it herself, and he'd simply done it, without being asked, without announcing that he was doing it, without framing it as a favor. See, she folded the note and put it in her jacket pocket. See, the next 3 weeks moved in a different rhythm, the grinding urgency of the preceding months replaced by a different kind of busyness, the kind that felt purposeful rather than defensive. See, Carver's office continued building its case. The DA's office, working with investigators from 2 counties, filed formal charges against Crowder and the Variks. See, Harold began the preliminary hearing preparation on the civil side. See, the forensic examination of the forged signature came back conclusive, multiple authentication failures, ink inconsistent with the alleged date. See, and notary records from Celeste Varick's official log showing no entry corresponding to the supposed signing date. See, the agreement had been fabricated entirely, not adjusted or embellished. See, invented. Mara read the forensic report in Harold's office and felt the cold, deep anger she'd been carrying since the beginning crystallize into something cleaner. See, not relief exactly, more like clarity. The confirmation of what she'd known from the first moment she'd looked at that capital T curving the wrong way. See, her father had never signed anything for Silas Crowder. See, had never agreed to anything, had never had a conversation with that man that involved the northern pasture. See, she'd known that. Now everyone knew it. The preliminary hearing was set for a Thursday in late winter. See, Harold had told her she didn't need to attend. Her presence wasn't legally required, but Jonas and Lenora had both said they wanted to be there, and Eliza Rourke had said the same. See, and Mara wasn't the type to let other people carry weight she could share. See, she asked Gideon the night before, standing in her kitchen after a dinner that had been Gideon cooking something out of what was in her refrigerator because she'd forgotten to eat again, and he'd apparently noticed. See, will you come tomorrow, she said, to the hearing. See, he looked up from the table where he'd been reading something on his phone. See, yes, he said, without hesitation, without negotiating the terms. See, she turned back to the dishes she was washing, which was something to do with her hands. See, you don't have to, she said. I know, that was all. See, the morning of the hearing was gray and cold, the kind of winter morning that doesn't apologize for itself. See, Mara dressed carefully, not formally. She didn't own courtroom formal, but clean and deliberate, the way you dress when you want to look like someone who cannot be dismissed. See, she was at the truck at 7:15. Gideon was in the passenger seat at 7:15. See, she hadn't asked him what time he'd arrived. She'd seen his truck by the gate when she came out of the house, and he'd gotten out and moved to her passenger side without discussion, and she'd gotten in the driver's side. See, and they'd driven to the county seat without talking for the first 20 minutes. See, not uncomfortable silence. Just the silence of two people who had been through enough together that not every space needed filling. See, how are you doing? Gideon said at the 15-minute mark. See, she kept her eyes on the road. Ask me again in 3 hours, she said. See, he didn't push it. The county courthouse was a solid, unremarkable building that smelled like old wood and institutional coffee, and the hearing room where Crowder's arraignment was being held was smaller than she'd expected, not a grand space. See, just a working room with rows of wooden seats and an elevated bench at the front where the judge sat with the particular expression of someone who had seen many things and was not inclined to theater. See, she found her group in the rows of seats. Jonas Rourke, in a clean jacket, with Eliza beside him, who looked thinner than when Mara had last seen her, but steadier, with a quality of resolution about her that hadn't been there before. See, Lenora Vale, who had driven herself and arrived first, and was sitting with her purse on her lap and her back very straight. See, Harold at the end of the row with his briefcase and his careful, watchful expression. See, Mara sat between Gideon and Eliza. Crowder came in with his new attorney, the second one, the original having withdrawn, and he looked different from the mental image she'd carried. See, she'd never actually seen him up close before. See, he was in his 60s, well-dressed in the specific way of someone who understood that appearance functioned as argument, and he had the kind of face that in other circumstances you might describe as reasonable. See, approachable, even. The face of a man who had talked his way into rooms for decades and expected to talk his way through this one. See, he scanned the rows when he entered. His eyes found her. See, she held his gaze. She didn't look away. She didn't shift or soften or give him the satisfaction of being a woman he'd rattled. See, she sat in that wooden chair in the county courthouse, where she'd driven herself on the morning of her father's funeral, and someone had filed a claim against the land she was still grieving. See, and she looked at Silas Crowder the way she looked at a fence line that needed assessing directly, without sentiment, without flinching. See, he looked away first. The hearing itself was procedural and not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. See, There were no speeches, no emotional confrontations. See, the charges were read fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and several specific counts related to the notarization scheme, and Crowder's attorney entered a not guilty plea in the even, professional tone of a man being paid to say it. See, the judge set conditions, reviewed the evidence summary Harold had submitted on behalf of the civil claimants, and asked two sharp questions that Crowder's attorney struggled to answer with any conviction. See, at one point the judge looked up from a document and said, quietly but clearly, that the volume of evidence presented on the forgery count was, in her estimation, considerable. See, that was all she said about it. It was enough. When Crowder's attorney formally withdrew every remaining civil claim against Red Willow Ranch, entered into the record as part of the hearing's secondary proceedings, Harold leaned over and wrote, see, something on a small piece of paper and passed it to Mara. See, uncontested, permanent. She folded it and held it. See, outside the courthouse afterward, the group assembled on the steps in the cold gray air, and there was a strange quality to the moment, not celebration exactly. See, because what had happened to these families wasn't something that resolved cleanly into celebration, but something quieter and more durable. See, the particular feeling of a thing being named that had been nameless for too long. See, Jonas shook hands with Harold and then turned to Mara. See, he looked at her for a moment, and his eyes were bright in the way of a man who was not going to cry out here in the cold, but was making a decision about it. See, your father, he said. He would if he stopped. See, pressed his mouth together. He raised somebody worth knowing, is what I'm saying. See, Mara nodded once. Her throat was doing something she was going to ignore. See, thank you, Jonas, she said. Eliza touched her arm. See, just briefly, just a light pressure. 4 years, she said quietly. See, I kept that notebook for 4 years, and I didn't know what good it would do. See, it did what it needed to do, Mara said. Lenora Vale came last because Lenora moved at her own pace and always had. See, she stood in front of Mara on the courthouse steps and looked at her with those sharp measuring eyes, and then she said, "You look terrible." See, Mara almost laughed. She felt it move through her before she caught it. See, I haven't slept properly in 8 weeks. I know. See, go home and fix that. Lenora paused. Your father would have liked what you did here. See, not the dramatic parts. The part where you went door to door and asked strangers to trust you. She held Mara's gaze. See, that took more courage than the fence work. She walked away before Mara could respond, which was very Lenora. See, Harold pulled her aside briefly. The DA's office wants a statement from you for the record. See, nothing complicated. I'll be with you. He looked at her over his glasses. See, not today. Next week. You need a few days. I'm fine, Harold. See, you haven't slept properly in 8 weeks. Lenora is correct. He paused. See, next week. She didn't argue. Driving back, Gideon was quiet for the first portion of the trip, which was his normal state, but there was a different quality to it than usual. See, she was aware of him in the passenger seat in a way she couldn't entirely account for, had been aware of him the whole morning in the same way, though she'd been focused on other things. See, you should eat something, he said eventually. I'm going to. See, when? When I get home. He looked out the window at the passing county road. See, I'll make something. She started to say it wasn't necessary, and then she stopped herself. The way she'd been stopping herself more often in recent weeks when that reflex rose up. See, she thought about what it actually cost her to say okay. See, she thought about what it cost her to keep saying it wasn't necessary. See, okay, she said. He made soup from what was in her kitchen. She had no idea how he did that. She'd looked in the refrigerator that morning and seen nothing usable, and they sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon light and ate it. See, and the dog lay under the table with his chin on Gideon's boot, and outside the window the northern pasture was exactly where it had always been. See, what happens now, Gideon said. She considered the question. See, not the legal now, the case, the trial, the process that would move forward without her daily involvement. See, the other now. I finish the estate update with Harold next week, she said. See, the spring contract prep starts in about 3 weeks. See, The east fence needs proper work before the ground gets too hard. She paused. See, and I want to do something at the Ranchers' Association meeting. See, what Crowder did the pattern of it, how he selected people. See, I want to explain it. Teach people what to look for. See, Gideon looked at her across the table. That'll take courage, he said. See, standing up at that meeting and telling it. Lenora told me the courage was the door-to-door part, she said. See, Lenora was right about that too. He wrapped his hands around his soup bowl. See, I'll come to the meeting, if you want. She looked at him. See, he was looking at the table the way he did when he'd said something that had a weight to it and was giving her space to decide what to do with it. See, yes, she said, I want. He nodded, kept eating. See, that should have been the end of the day, practically speaking. See, she was exhausted, and the hearing was over, and the soup was finished, and there was nothing left that required doing. See, he should have gone home. She should have gone to sleep. See, instead she poured 2 cups of coffee she didn't need at 4 in the afternoon, and they stayed at the table, and she told him things she hadn't told anyone, not even Harold. See, about the morning of the funeral, about sitting in her father's chair the night Harold called. See, about riding out to his property in the dark and rehearsing a speech and losing it the moment she saw him standing at that fence post. See, I had a whole speech, she said. I know. You knew? See, you had the look of someone who'd rehearsed something, he said. See, and then didn't use it. What did I look like instead? See, he thought about that for a moment. Actually thought about it, the way he thought about things all the way to the end. See, someone who'd stripped everything down to what was real, he said. See, and said that she held her coffee cup. Why did you say yes, she said. See, before I explained anything, he looked at her. You want the honest answer or the easy one? See, the honest one. He turned his coffee cup around once. See, I've known about Red Willow my whole life. Knew your father by reputation before I ever spoke to him. See, I knew what that land meant to your family. He paused. See, and I knew what it meant that you rode out there before sunrise instead of making phone calls. See, you weren't looking for the easiest option. You were looking for something real. He set the cup down. See, I've spent a long time around people who want things from other people. See, I could tell you weren't that. The kitchen was very quiet. See, and the other reason, she said, because she could tell there was one. She'd gotten good at reading the specific architecture of his silences. See, a longer pause. I've been alone for 6 years, he said. See, not unhappily. I want to be clear about that. But he stopped. See, chose the next words carefully. When you rode up that morning. See, before you said anything, I thought, here's someone worth knowing better. See, she looked at him. He looked back. See, this was the moment she would have retreated from 3 months ago, put something practical between herself and what was being said, redirected toward logistics or legal matters or the actual transaction they'd arranged. See, the reflex was still there. She felt it. She set it aside. See, the arrangement we made, she said. It's the legal situation is resolved. See, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. She stopped. See, I know what the arrangement was, he said. I know what I said I'd accept if you wanted to end it. He looked at her steadily. See, I want to be sure you know that offer stands. If you want out, I'll sign whatever Harold needs. See, no argument. The afternoon light was long and thin through the kitchen window, the kind of winter light that makes everything look a little more stripped down than usual, a little more actual. See, and if I don't want out, she said, he held her gaze. See, then I'll still be here tomorrow morning, checking the creekside fence post, he said. See, same as I was going to do anyway. She looked at him for a long moment. See, the man who had said yes before she finished asking. See, who had held her hands in the dark to get the circulation back. See, who had cooked soup out of nothing and sat at her table and told her the honest answer when she asked for it. See, who had never once asked her to be less than exactly who she was. See, Gideon, she said, yeah, the arrangement is done. She held his eyes. See, I'm not staying because of a legal document. Something shifted in his expression. See, not dramatic, he was not a dramatic man, but real and visible, if you knew where to look. See, okay, he said. She set her coffee cup down. Don't say okay like it's a fence post. See, the almost smile came, and this time it went all the way. See, okay, he said again, differently. Outside, Red Willow was quiet in the late afternoon, the cattle settled, the fence lines intact, the northern pasture lying still and pale gold in the winter light. See, the property her father had given his life to, that she'd almost lost, that she'd fought for post by post, and document by document, and sleepless night by sleepless night. See, hers, completely and without question hers. See, she picked up her coffee cup again and looked across the table, at the man who had helped her keep it, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could measure, that the weight she'd been carrying had somewhere real to rest. See, she didn't say any of that. She didn't need to. He was already pouring her a second cup of coffee she didn't need, and the dog had moved from under the table to the doorway where it could see both of them at once, and the kitchen was warm. See, and outside the light was going that particular gold her father had always loved. See, she let it be what it was. The second cup of coffee she didn't need turned into a third. See, and by the time Gideon finally drove home, that evening the sky was fully dark, and the temperature had dropped another 6 degrees, and Mara stood at the kitchen window watching his headlights move down the access road. See, until they turned onto the county road and disappeared. See, she stood there a moment longer than made any practical sense. See, then she went to bed and slept for 10 hours without waking, which was the first time she'd done that since before her father died. See, she woke up the next morning to frost on the window glass and the particular quality of silence that means snow is coming, and she felt not light exactly. See, nothing that simple, but something that had been compressed for months had released itself slightly. See, like a fence wire backed off one turn on the stretcher. See, still taut, still doing its job, but not about to snap. See, she made coffee and stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the northern pasture in the gray pre-dawn, and it looked back at her the way it always had, indifferent and honest and entirely hers. And she thought, okay. See, okay. The Ranchers Association meeting was 3 weeks out, and she'd been turning it over in her mind since she mentioned it to Gideon at the kitchen table. See, the idea of standing up in front of 40 or 50 neighboring landowners and telling them what Crowder had done, not just to her, but the pattern of it, the selection criteria. See, the specific vulnerabilities he'd exploited felt different every time she imagined it. See, some days it felt necessary and clear. Some days it felt like the kind of thing she said she'd do and then found 17 practical reasons to defer. See, she called Lenora Vale on a Tuesday morning, partly because she needed to talk through the logistics, and partly because Lenora was the kind of person whose opinion functioned as a useful corrective to any tendency toward self-deception. See, I'm planning to present at the March meeting, Mara said. See, what Crowder did, the method of it, what to watch for. See, good, Lenora said. I'm not sure how to frame it without, she paused. See, without it becoming a story about me. Lenora was quiet for a moment. See, it's not a story about you, she said. It's a story about a system. See, you're just the one who understood the system well enough to explain it. A pause. See, make it practical. Tell them what a fraudulent claim looks like from the outside when it arrives. See, tell them what questions to ask. Don't make it a grievance meeting. See, make it a training. Mara wrote that down. Not the words, the instinct behind them. See, will you come, she said. You and Jonas. We'll be there, Lenora said. See, the DA's office called on a Wednesday, and the woman on the phone, a deputy district attorney named Pressler, who sounded young and organized and about as interested in small talk as Mara was, walked her through what a formal statement would look. See, like, and what the trial timeline was expected to be. See, Mara listened and asked 2 specific questions and answered several others. And at the end, Pressler said, I want to be transparent with you. The forgery count is the strongest single charge. See, but the conspiracy case is what will carry the most weight in terms of sentencing. See, that case is built significantly on the connection between Crowder and the Variks, and that connection came directly from Eliza Rourke's testimony. See, I know, Mara said. You found her, Pressler said. See, it wasn't quite a question. Her father-in-law pointed me toward her. See, she made the decision herself, a brief pause. Well, see, whatever the sequence was, it mattered. Mara gave her formal statement the following week, in Harold's office, with a recorder on the desk, and Harold sitting to her left making occasional quiet notes. See, she told it factually, in order, without editorializing, the same way she'd have described a fence line problem to a contractor. Here's where it broke. Here's what I found when I looked closely. Here's the sequence of repairs. See, Pressler had told her that was exactly the right approach, and Harold had agreed, and Mara had been doing it that way instinctively anyway, because she'd never found embellishment useful. See, when it was done, Harold turned off the recorder and looked at her. See, how do you feel, he said. Like I'm glad that's in writing, she said. See, he smiled, actually smiled, which Harold did rarely enough that she noticed it every time. See, your father, he said, used to say something. When a deal was finally settled after a long negotiation. See, he'd say, now it's just time, he paused. That's where you are. See, it's going to take time, but the foundation is solid. See, she drove home through early March light, the kind that's still cold but carries the first suggestion of warmth underneath it. The angle of the sun shifted just enough to be noticeable if you'd been paying attention to it all winter. See, she'd been paying attention to it all winter. She noticed it every year at the same time her father had pointed it out to her when she was 9 years old, and she'd never stopped seeing it. See, the creekside fence post that Gideon had identified in his note was the project for that afternoon. See, she'd ordered the materials, she had the tools, and the ground was soft enough on the south side of the post to work with. See, she was halfway through the repair when she heard his truck coming down the access road, and she kept working because the daylight was limited and she was almost done. See, he came over the fence and picked up at the tamping bar without being asked and finished tamping the base of the new post while she held the alignment. See, you didn't have to come out here today, she said. See, I had time, he said. She held the post he tamped. See, the work was the work and it didn't need commentary. See, when it was done and they were standing back, looking at the post, level and solid in the thawing ground, she said, the ranchers' meeting. See, I've been thinking about how to frame it. He was quiet, waiting. See, Lenora said to make it a training, not a grievance meeting. She looked at the post. See, I think she's right. But I keep running into the problem of if I'm too clinical about it, people don't feel the urgency. See, and if I'm too personal about it, it becomes about me and not about what to do. See, Gideon pulled his work gloves off one at a time and folded them into his jacket pocket. See, he did this slowly, thinking in the way he thought. See, tell Jonas's story, he said finally. Not yours. See, his. 4 months after his wife died, a man showed up with papers, and Jonas was in no position to evaluate them. He looked at her. See, that's what people need to hear, not the legal framework they'll glaze over on that. See, they need to understand that these things happen in the worst moments of your life, when your judgment is most compromised, and they're designed to happen exactly then. See, she looked at him. That's what you'd say, she said. See, that's what I'd say. I'm a better rancher than I am a public speaker. See, you're a better everything than you think you are, he said, with the same flat matter-of-factness he'd use to note that a water pressure reading was off. See, not a compliment, a correction of an inaccuracy. She looked away before he could see what that did to her face. See, Jonas agreed when she called him to let her tell his story at the meeting. See, he was quiet for a moment first, and she thought he was going to say no or ask to think about it. See, tell it right, he said instead. Don't make me sound like a fool. See, I wasn't a fool. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time without enough information. See, that's exactly how I'll tell it, she said. He was quiet again. See, then, my daughter-in-law, Eliza. This has been hard on her. See, giving that testimony, going through all of that, but she's different since. See, more like herself, I think. Like she put something down that she'd been carrying too long. He paused. See, I think you gave her that, the chance to put it down. See, Mara sat with that for a moment. She gave it to herself, Mara said. See, I just opened the door. Spring arrived in increments the way it always did, not all at once. Not a single morning where everything changed, but gradually the ground softening a degree at a time, the grass coming back in low places first. See, the creek running higher with snowmelt, the cattle starting to move differently, more purposefully, the way animals do when the feed is getting better, and the cold is finally loosening its grip. See, Mara fulfilled the spring cattle contract, all 63 head. See, the weights came in above projection. The buyer, a man named Daniels, who'd been doing business with Red Willow since her father's time, shook her hand after the weigh-in and said the animals looked better than last year's run. See, which was the highest praise a practical man like Daniels offered. See, she drove home from the weigh-in with the contract figures on a paper on the passenger seat and felt something settle that had been suspended since the day Harold called her the evening of the funeral. See, the thing her father had built was still producing. See, still standing. All of it, she called Harold. The spring contract settled above projection, she said. See, good, he said. That's very good. A pause. Your father would have had specific opinions about the margins. See, he absolutely would have, and you'd have argued with him for 20 minutes and then come to exactly his conclusion. See, she smiled. She was alone in the truck and she let herself do it fully. See, probably, she said. The ranchers' meeting was a Thursday night in the third week of March. See, 43 people in the County Agricultural Extension Building, which was a wide, plain room with fold-out chairs and fluorescent lighting, and a podium that someone had clearly built themselves about 30 years ago out of good intentions and whatever lumber was available. See, Mara stood at that podium and looked at the room. She knew most of the faces. See, had grown up knowing them, or knowing their parents, or doing business with them at the feed supply or across a fence line or at the county fair. See, these were people who worked land the way her father had worked, land not abstractly, not as an investment category, but with their hands and their bodies and their particular stubbornness. See, she'd written out notes and then not used them, because reading off notes in front of people you'd known your whole life felt dishonest. See, she started with Jonas's story, told it the way he'd asked, not making him sound like a fool, because he wasn't one, because what had happened to him was what happened to careful people when they were caught at the worst possible moment. See, she watched faces in the room as she talked, watched them go from polite attention to something sharper. See, watched a woman in the third row mid-50s, ran a hay operation with her husband on the south end of the county, lean forward slightly. See, she moved from Jonas to Lenora, and Lenora was sitting in the second row and did not change her expression at all during this part, which was very Lenora. See, she described how Crowder had selected his targets. See, not randomly, not opportunistically, deliberately. See, he'd watched for obituaries, for probate filings, for estate complications in the public record. See, he'd identified families in transition and approached them within months of a death or financial difficulty with documents that looked legitimate and arguments that were designed to overwhelm rather than persuade. See, she described the holding companies, the notarizations done without landowners present. See, the pattern of arguments that escalated when the first approach failed. See, she told them about the capital T. The woman in the third row said quietly, "The signature on the document my husband signed when his mother died." See, Mara stopped. The woman looked at her. Her face was carefully controlled, the way someone looks when they've been sitting on something for a long time and are only now beginning to allow it to surface. See, he signed over mineral rights on the South Quarter, the woman said. See, 3 months after his mother passed. We always thought it was a legitimate agreement, just a bad one. See, we didn't. She stopped. What you're describing? See, the timing, the approach. Mara held the woman's gaze. See, talk to Harold Birch, she said after the meeting. See, tonight. She looked around the room. See, if anyone here has had a similar experience, a land agreement signed in the period following a death or a financial difficulty, an approach from someone you didn't know well with paperwork, you didn't fully understand, talk to Harold. See, this investigation is still active. There may be more cases. See, Harold, seated to the side of the room, had already uncapped his pen. See, after the formal portion, the room broke into the specific kind of conversation that happens when people who've been carrying individual concerns discover they're not alone in having them. See, not loud, not chaotic measured, neighbor to neighbor, the kind of talk that moves through a community like water finding level. See, 3 people approached Harold before the meeting had been cleared out. See, 3 people who hadn't been part of the original case. See, 3 people with stories that bore the specific fingerprints of the same system. See, Mara stood at the back of the room and watched Harold take down names and notes and felt the weight of it not triumphantly, not with any sense of clean satisfaction. See, but with the sobering awareness that the damage ran deeper than even she'd calculated. See, Gideon came to stand beside her. 3 more, she said quietly. See, he looked at Harold and the people gathered around him. See, yeah, I thought we'd gotten all of it. You never get all of it first, he said. See, you get what you can reach, and then more surfaces. See, she stood there in the clearing room with the fluorescent lights humming overhead. See, is that supposed to be comforting? She said. It's supposed to be true, he said. See, comforting is different. She almost smiled. You're a difficult man to have around, you know that. See, you've mentioned it. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching Harold work the room. See, you did well tonight. Lenora's framing helped. See, Lenora gave you a frame. You built the house. He glanced at her. See, there's a difference. She didn't argue. Not because he was wrong. See, Eliza Rourke found her by the door on the way out. See, she looked better than she had at the courthouse, not repaired, nothing that clean, but moving differently. See, less like someone bracing for something. I heard what that woman said, Eliza said. See, about the mineral rights, I know. There might be more like that. See, cases that went through the Varick office that nobody connected. She paused. See, I've been thinking about whether I should talk to Pressler again. See, go through what I remember more systematically. That's your call, Mara said. See, I know. Eliza looked at her. I just wanted to say I came here tonight because you asked me to. See, and watching you talk about what happened to Jonas and to Lenora and to the others without making it about yourself, she stopped. See, I've spent 4 years feeling like I failed them because I didn't act sooner. See, tonight I felt something different. Mara wasn't sure what to say to that. See, what did you feel? Eliza thought about it. Like maybe the time I did it matters more than the time I didn't. See, she walked out. Mara stood at the door for a moment, watching her go, feeling the truth of that land somewhere specific. See, the trial moved through its phases over the following months with the grinding institutional patience of the legal system, which did not care about anyone's emotional timeline or their need for resolution. See, Mara gave her formal testimony in May, sitting in the same courtroom where she'd watched the preliminary hearing, and she answered Pressler's questions the same way she'd given her statement factually, in order, without embellishment. See, Crowder's defense attorney tried, during cross-examination, to suggest that Mara had orchestrated the investigation to manufacture a case against a man who simply had a legitimate legal dispute with her. See, he used the word orchestrated 3 times in 4 questions, which she recognized as a rhetorical technique and found unimpressive. See, she answered each question directly, with specific reference to documented evidence, and did not get flustered, because she had nothing to be flustered about. See, when Pressler stood for redirect and asked Mara whether the forged signature had been the first time she'd seen evidence of Crowder using false documentation, Mara said, "It was the most visible evidence. See, because I recognized my father's handwriting, and that signature didn't match it. See, but the pattern existed before the forgery. The forgery was just the moment he got careless." See, the woman in the jury box to the far left, the one who'd been taking consistent notes throughout the trial, wrote something down when Mara said that. See, she noticed. Roland and Celeste Varick both pleaded guilty in June, before their trial began. See, Pressler told Mara the plea deals had included full cooperation with the ongoing investigation into other properties and other agreements. See, The three people who'd come forward at the ranchers' meeting became part of that expanded investigation, along with two others identified through the Varick's cooperation. See, in total, 11 properties across 2 counties had been touched by the scheme in various degrees over 9 years. See, 11 families. Some of them had fought and lost ground. See, some had signed things under pressure. Some had settled for fractions of what their land was worth. See, some, like Mara, had been in the process of being targeted when it unraveled. See, Crowder was convicted in July on 6 counts, including fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. See, he received a sentence that Pressler described as appropriate to the scope and duration of the conduct, which was prosecutor language for significant. See, he walked into that sentencing hearing with the face of a man who still believed, somewhere underneath it all, that his particular combination of confidence and calculation would find a way to work the situation. See, he walked out with none of that visible. Mara was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. See, she was at Red Willow, checking the northern fence line on the July morning it happened, because the cattle were grazing the northern pasture that week, and she checked it every few days out of the habit she'd built over the winter. See, she stood at the line and looked north, at the land on the other side, at the county grassland that ran on past the boundary, and she felt the particular clarity of a thing that is simply over. See, not erased, not as though it had never happened, but finished. See, done the way work gets done, not perfectly, not without cost, not in the way you'd have designed it if you'd had the option to design it, but done. See, her phone rang. Harold. The sentencing came down, he said. See, she already knew from his voice that it had gone the way Pressler had projected. See, okay, she said, it's over, Mara. See, she looked at the northern fence line, at the posts she and Gideon had reset in the dark at Van in the morning in January while cattle drifted through a deliberate breach and the cold worked its way through every layer she was wearing. See, yeah, she said, it is. The summer was the hardest work she'd done in years, but a different kind of hard productive, forward-moving, the kind that builds something rather than defends it. See, she rebuilt the east fence properly, with post holes set deep and corners braced correctly, not the patch-and-hope repairs of a cash-strapped year, but real work. See, she repaired the south barn roof with the help of a crew she hired from town, 2 brothers and a cousin who worked efficiently and didn't talk unnecessarily, which she appreciated. See, she upgraded the water system on the north tank, new fittings throughout, a secondary shut-off that couldn't be accessed from outside the fence perimeter. See, she did not build that last feature purely out of practical necessity. See, she knew that. She didn't examine it too closely. See, Gideon's property and hers overlapped in work more often that summer than they had in the previous months, which had happened gradually enough that neither of them had particularly marked the transition. See, he would mention that he was moving a hay delivery and ask if she needed anything from the same supplier. See, she would see him working his east fence line from across the county road and bring coffee over. See, it was not dramatic or decided, it was the slow, practical accumulation of 2 properties that had started functioning as a unit without either of their proprietors formally declaring that was what was happening. See, they were both too practical and possibly too stubborn to say anything about it for a long time. See, the moment it became undeniable was a Saturday in late August when Gideon showed up at 7 in the morning with a load of fencing materials she hadn't ordered. See, she came out of the barn and looked at the materials in the back of his truck. See, I didn't order those, she said. I know, he got out. See, the northwest corner of your property. The corner posts have been moving for 2 years. See, you've been resetting them instead of replacing them. See, she looked at him. I do that because replacing them is expensive, she said. See, I know why you do it. He went around to the back of the truck. See, I've had these materials since spring. I've been waiting for you to let me help with it. See, I didn't ask. I know you didn't ask. He looked at her over the truck bed, and there was something in his face that was both patient and direct, the specific combination she'd come to understand as his version of emphasis. See, Mara, I'm going to help you replace these corner posts because it's the right repair, and you need it done, and I have the materials. See, you can be difficult about it, or we can just do the work. See, but I'm not taking these back. See, she stood in the morning sun with grease on her hands from the barn work and looked at this man who had said yes before. She finished asking and held her hands in the dark to warm them and cooked soup from nothing, and showed up at 7 in the morning with fencing materials she hadn't ordered because he'd been watching the northwest corner posts for 2 years and waiting for her to be ready to let someone help. See, the south side first, she said. The post there is worse. See, he nodded, came around to the side of the truck and started unloading. See, they worked the northwest corner all day in the heat of a late August morning that slowly gave way to a hot afternoon, and neither of them talked much because the work didn't require it. See, and the dog lay in the shade of the truck and watched them with the contented expression of an animal that has understood something its humans are still working out. See, in the middle of the afternoon, when she was holding the alignment on the second corner post and Gideon was setting the depth, she said, "This partnership." See, he kept working. "What about it? It's not a temporary arrangement anymore." See, he stopped, looked up at her. "I know," he said, "just that." See, "I'm not talking about the marriage certificate," she said. See, "I'm talking about this." She gestured vaguely, which could have meant the fence or the property, or the two of them standing in the August heat, doing work neither of them had asked the other to do, and both of them were doing anyway. See, Gideon held the post steady and looked at her. "I know what you're talking about," he said. See, and I knew that before you did, he said, without anything like arrogance, just the flat accuracy of a man stating an observable fact. See, I've been waiting for you to get there. She held the post alignment and felt something that was not embarrassment exactly, but was adjacent to it. See, the awareness that someone had been further along than her and hadn't pushed, hadn't maneuvered, see, had just waited with the specific patience of someone who understood that some things couldn't be rushed and wasn't interested in the version that was rushed. See, "How long have you been waiting?" she said. He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. See, "Since the morning you rode up to my fence line before sunrise and said 5 words and stopped." He held her gaze. See, "You stopped because you'd gotten to the real thing. See, that's who you are. You'll get through everything that isn't essential, and then you'll stop at the thing that is." A pause. See, "I've been waiting for you to get through everything else." See, she didn't have a response to that. She was not generally a person who didn't have a response to things. See, she finished setting the post. They didn't resolve anything further in words that afternoon, because neither of them was particularly given to resolving things in words when the thing itself was already resolved. See, they finished the northwest corner and loaded the extra materials back in the truck, and she made dinner and he stayed for it. See, and afterward they sat on the porch in the cooling evening air, because August in this part of the country turned cool early in the evenings, and the porch faced west and caught the last light. See, the northern pasture was visible from the porch, full of cattle, the grass good, the fence lines standing straight. See, "My father used to sit out here in the evenings," she said. See, not to anyone in particular, to the air. Gideon was beside her, not touching, just there. See, "What did he think about?" he said. "I never knew exactly. See, I'd come out and sit with him sometimes, and we'd watch the pasture." She paused. See, "I think he was just looking at what he'd made, checking that it was still there." See, Gideon nodded slowly. "That's a good use of an evening," he said. See, she looked at the northern pasture, at the fence line solid in the fading light. See, at the cattle moving slowly in the July-August. She corrected herself. August heat, unhurried, going about the business of being cattle on land that had enough grass and enough water and enough security for them to simply be what they were. "See, Gideon," she said. "Yeah, I'm certain," she said. See, he was quiet for a moment, just the sounds of the evening, the insects starting up, the cattle settling. See, "About what specifically?" he said, and she could hear the almost smile in his voice. See, "You asked me once at the beginning, before we signed anything. See, you asked if I was certain about the condition." She looked at him. See, I'm certain about more than the condition. He looked back at her. See, yeah, he said. The same word he always used, but with that specific different quality she'd learned to hear. See, the one that meant something had landed where he meant it to land. See, me too. She looked back at the pasture. He looked back at the pasture. See, the dogs settled at their feet with a satisfied groan. See, the light went that particular gold. See, and then the gold went to rose. See, and then to the gray-blue of early dark. See, and neither of them moved. See, because there was nowhere to be. See, the months that followed were not uncomplicated. Ranching was never uncomplicated. See, a late September storm took out 2 sections of the east fence line she'd just rebuilt, which cost her 2 days of work and more than she'd budgeted. See, the cattle contract for the following year came in slightly lower than she'd hoped because the buyer's market had shifted, and she spent 3 evenings running numbers and adjusting the spring plan. See, one of her older cows lost a calf in October, and that particular loss settled on her for a few days the way those losses do, dull and specific, reminding you that the work was not abstract. See, Gideon's season had its own complications. An equipment breakdown in October that was expensive to fix. See, a disagreement with his hay supplier that required 2 weeks of finding alternatives. See, the ongoing work of running 280 acres that did not stop requiring attention simply because things elsewhere were going well. See, they navigated it the way people who've learned to work alongside each other navigate things, not without friction, not without occasional disagreement, but without drama. See, and without the particular wasted energy of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. See, once in October she made a decision about the spring planting schedule for the northern pasture without consulting him, and he had a different opinion about it that he expressed directly. See, and she initially dismissed his reasoning because it cut against what she'd already decided. See, and they stood in her kitchen being fairly direct with each other for about 10 minutes before she reconsidered and realized his read on the soil moisture pattern in that section was better than hers and adjusted the plan. See, she did not make a speech about it. He did not make her. See, that was the thing, she thought, that she kept coming back to. See, not the large events, not the courthouse, not the sentencing, not the moments that would be visible from the outside as significant. See, the thing she kept coming back to was the texture of the daily work. See, the way he said what he thought and she said what she thought, and neither of them made the other wrong for thinking it. See, the way he could be in the same space with her when she was short-tempered and tired and not try to fix it, just continue being present until she'd worked through it herself. See, the way she'd learned to say things she needed to say before the silence around them got load-bearing. See, she was not good at all of this. She was better than she had been. See, that was the actual story, she thought, not the fence cutting or the forged signature or the courtroom. See, those things had happened and mattered and were finished. See, the actual story was this: a woman who'd been carrying everything alone for so long that it had become her definition of who she was, learning slowly and imperfectly that carrying it together wasn't weakness. See, it was just a different kind of structure, like a fence with 2 corner posts instead of 1. See, the winter came in earnest in November, the first hard snow of the season arriving on a Sunday night. See, she woke before dawn on Monday to check the cattle, which was the kind of thing you did without deciding to, and the air outside was still and white, and very cold, and the cattle were settled and fine. See, she walked back toward the house in the early dark, snow still falling in that quiet, purposeful way of the first real snow of winter, and the lights of the house were on. See, she hadn't left them on. She stood for a moment in the falling snow, looking at the lit windows of the house that had been very quiet for a very long time, see, and felt something move through her that she wasn't going to try to name, because some things are large enough that naming them reduces them. See, she went inside. See, Gideon was at the kitchen counter with the coffee already made, wearing his jacket still from having been outside himself, checking the outbuildings or the water lines or whatever. He'd gotten up to check before she'd gotten up herself. See, he looked at her when she came in. She looked at him. See, cattle are fine, she said. Water lines are fine, he said. See, I checked the north tank. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook next to her father's coat that she'd never moved. See, he poured 2 cups. Outside the window, the snow was covering the northern pasture, covering the fence lines that had been cut and repaired and cut again and rebuilt properly, covering the ground that someone had tried to take and couldn't. See, covering the land that was simply, completely, irrevocably hers. See, she took the cup he held out and turned to look out the window. See, he stood beside her. The pasture went on being white and quiet and indifferent and real. See, she'd learned things in the last year that she hadn't expected to learn. See, she'd learned that the people who want to hurt you are almost always counting on your isolation, that what they fear most is not your strength, but your connections. See, the way one thread attached to another makes a structure that can't be easily pulled apart. See, she'd learned that asking for help was its own kind of courage, separate from, and not lesser than the courage of fighting. See, she'd learned that the marks her father had put on the doorframe when she was a child, all those small penciled lines, were not measurements of how tall she was. See, they were measurements of how long she'd been known. See, she'd learned that some people say yes before you finish asking, not because they're reckless, but because they've already read the situation clearly and decided, and the only thing left is to say it. See, she'd learned what it felt like to let someone read her clearly and not flinch away from being seen. See, she was still learning that last one. She suspected she would be for a long time. See, she drank her coffee. The snow fell on Red Willow Ranch, 600 acres of hard-earned ground in Stonehaven County, and the cattle stood in the white pasture with their breath making small clouds in the cold air, and the fence lines held. See, and the house was warm, and there was nothing left to fight. See, she was home. He was already there. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, those 2 facts were the same fact. And that was enough, and more than enough, and exactly what it was.